Robert Lemon was born on March 4, 1983, in a small town in California. From his childhood, he was characterized by his sociability and friendliness. He was a cheerful teenager who always found a common language with others. Robert had a large circle of friends, and those who knew him spoke about him as a person who can be trusted, who is always ready to help and support. His parents, David and Janet Lemon, raised him in an atmosphere of respect and hard work. The family was not wealthy, but they lived quite comfortably, always low-key, with love and care. Robert graduated from the local high school, where he was one of the popular students. He actively participated in school activities and was also passionate about sports and technology. His dream was to become a firefighter, like many boys, because the profession was associated with risk, heroism, and the opportunity to help people. But as he grew up, he realized that the path to this dream could be long and require a lot of effort and sacrifice. Therefore, without giving up hope, Robert decided to take a more practical step and got a job at the local railroad shop. However, his life was not limited to work and study. It was at this point, at the age of 22, that Robert met a girl named Sabrina. They met at a mutual friend's wedding, where Robert immediately caught Sabrina's attention with his confidence and charm. She was intelligent, independent, and a very charismatic woman. Their conversations at first sight appeared easy and casual. Robert listened to her with interest, and she could feel herself beginning to grow attached to him with every word. Sabrina was a couple of years younger than Robert, but that didn't hinder their relationship. She was born and raised in a neighboring town, and her life had been tied to the Christian faith since she was a little girl. After graduating from college, she got a job too, at a local church, where her role involved organizing activities for the youth and helping the congregation. This was a surprising discovery for Robert. Sabrina was a strong woman who believed very strongly in God, and with that came the ability to maintain and nurture relationships. This quality of hers was what at one point caught his attention and captured his heart. The couple began dating, and their relationship grew rapidly. They both believed that they had met their soulmate. 2 years after meeting, Robert proposed to Sabrina to become his wife. It was an exciting and beautiful proposal. On an evening walk in the park, under the stars, Robert got down on one knee and asked for her hand in marriage. Sabrina, without hesitation, agreed. The wedding took place in 1929 in a small but very solemn ceremony with the presence of family and friends. Their relationship was strong and stable from the beginning. As a young family, they lived in the Silver Lakes area of California, which was the perfect place for them, a small but very cozy community where everyone knew and supported each other. Robert and Sabrina became the parents of 2 children, a son Joshua and a daughter Emily. The Lemon family was full of love, care, and support. The children grew up in a supportive environment, surrounded by their parents' attention, and in an atmosphere of Christian values. Throughout the years, their lives seemed perfect. Robert continued to work as a mechanic at the local railroad station, which brought in a steady income. It was a job he loved, despite the fact that his dream of becoming a firefighter was never realized. He found fulfillment in his career, knowing that his labor was important to others and that he was part of the machinery that kept the country moving. Sabrina, for her part, was actively involved in her community. She organized volunteer projects and events, always stayed focused on helping people. While working at the church, she was one of those people who could always be called upon for advice and support. Despite their busy lives, the family always found time to relax together. Every Sunday they spent the day together, often going outdoors or attending family dinners with friends. Robert and Sabrina were an example to others, showing that it was possible to successfully combine family life with personal hobbies and careers. Every year they tried to take a vacation. For Robert and Sabrina, trips to religious places and participation in charity events were important, which further strengthened their connection to their faith and to each other. However, despite all of this, life doesn't always go according to plan. On August 17, 2014, an event occurred that shocked everyone who knew Robert Lemon. He was alone in a railroad shop in Tehachapi, California, about 135 kilometers from home, when he was suddenly the victim of an attack. The killer attacked him at a moment when Robert was unprotected and his life was ruthlessly taken. It was a fateful day that forever changed not only the lives of his family, but the entire community in which they lived. Around 9:00 a.m., when most people were just starting their workday, law enforcement received a call of a possible robbery at a BNSF warehouse located in Tehachapi, California. A company employee reported that a man was found with gunshot wounds inside the railroad shop. The signal was relayed to the nearest police station, and several patrols soon arrived on the scene. When the police reached the scene, they immediately noticed that the situation was not typical of a robbery. There was utter chaos in the warehouse room. Robert Limon was lying on the floor, and the blood marks stood out vividly against the dirty concrete. He was dressed in his work uniform, as one would expect of an employee of the local railroad company. Outwardly, the situation seemed as if the man had been at the center of something more violent than the usual criminal incident. Robert's body was in a rather gruesome condition. He had been shot twice. The first shot had gone through the stomach, but the second was fatal. A bullet fired from a large caliber weapon had penetrated his head, causing instant death. It is quite possible that Robert didn't even have time to realize what had happened. He was away from his home, on the grounds of an industrial facility where he was presumably supposed to feel safe. At first, law enforcement thought it was a robbery gone wrong. This was because the warehouse itself was located in an industrial area where other businesses operated, and the facility itself was filled with various appliances and parts. The fear of possible criminals wanting to seize a large sum of money or other valuables justified this hypothesis. However, when examining the scene and analyzing what was around, doubts arose. No valuables or documents were found. There were no obvious signs of a struggle at the scene, nor were there any signs that the killer was looking for money or valuables. All of this once again confirmed that this was something more than just a random crime. On further inspection of the area, police found several rounds of ammunition, which could also indicate a crime with a prearranged weapon. The condition of the room where the murder occurred also played an important role in understanding the events. The warehouse was semi-empty, with nothing visible that could have been used for defense or concealment. The location was most likely a random choice by the perpetrator rather than a pre-selected target. After a closer inspection of the area, CCTV cameras were found installed around the perimeter of the industrial park where the warehouse was located. Police immediately decided that this could be a crucial clue to solving the crime. They requested access to the footage in order to study the footage, to draw conclusions about the possible movements of the person who was near the murder scene. CCTV cameras could allow them to establish who was in the area at the time of the crime. In the meantime, the investigation continued to develop, and soon the police decided to notify Robert Limon's family of the tragic news. At first, it was hard to believe what had happened. Sabrina Limon, Robert's wife, was shocked by the news. She, like everyone who knew her and Robert, could not imagine that something like this could have happened to them. Their family was an example of a perfect life. 2 children, stable jobs, a friendly atmosphere. Everyone who knew them said they were a wonderful couple, and their family was cared for by the entire community. Sabrina, when she heard this terrible news, was instantly speechless. At the time of the notification of her husband's death, she was at home doing household chores. Her shock was evident, and her reaction was genuine. She couldn't believe this had happened to Robert, and her eyes clearly read not only confusion, but also anger that someone had taken her husband's life. She immediately began to support the children, trying to explain to them what had happened, although she herself was clearly at a loss as to how to live her life. When news of Robert Limon's murder spread, neighbors and friends were shocked. No one could believe that anyone could wish such a kind and decent man dead. Robert was known among his loved ones as a man with an open and kind heart, always ready to help. He and Sabrina seemed like the perfect couple. Their relationship was an example to many. Everyone who knew them spoke of a strong family supporting each other. Those close to them claimed that they always looked happy and harmonious, that their marriage was filled with love and mutual understanding. Many emphasized that Robert was a good husband and father, and his relations with his children and others were always warm and caring. But despite the outward idyll, No one knew what was going on in their private life behind closed doors, and what could be hiding behind this flawless picture. Robert's family couldn't understand who could have caused him such pain. Lots of people expressed condolences and offered their support. When police began investigating Robert Lemon's murder, several key points immediately caught their attention. One of the first steps investigators took was to obtain video footage from surveillance cameras installed in the industrial complex around the railroad depot in Tehachapi where the crime occurred. Those cameras could have captured the moment of the crime, and they did. The footage showed a suspicious motorcyclist who appeared near the depot on the day of the murder. The police noticed this footage because the motorcycle in the industrial area was prominent and could probably belong to the killer. However, at the time, the police could not definitively say that this was the crime, as the only data they had was an image of a motorcyclist moving in the area of the warehouse complex. Still, the footage was an important first step that gave police a direction for further searches. Investigators began gathering information, which was unusual for an investigation of this kind. They decided to focus not only on the physical evidence, but also on the more personal side of Robert and Sabrina Lemon's lives. After investigating the family circumstances, the police soon discovered that Sabrina Lemon was having an affair with 24-year-old Jonathan Hearn, a local firefighter known for his religiosity and good reputation in the community. This relationship was at first glance completely unnoticed, as the couple behaved quite normally in public places, and no one would have thought that there was something more lurking behind the closed doors of their lives. However, as soon as the police learned of the affair between Sabrina and Jonathan, they began to investigate his phone records. Once in the possession of the investigation, these records yielded shocking data. Thousands of messages and calls were found in their phones, confirming their close relationship. This fact was important enough to alert investigators to the personal connections between the suspects and bring new details to the investigation. The seemingly obvious connection between Sabrina and Jonathan opened new possibilities for understanding the motive of the murder, but at the same time left questions requiring additional evidence. Nevertheless, one aspect of Jonathan's behavior became even more suspicious. Despite the huge number of calls and messages in the previous days, his phone had not been used on the day of Robert Lemon's murder. This fact was quite strange and contrary to the normal practices of people involved in such a complex relationship. It didn't give investigators enough grounds for charges, but it became a red flag that further brought Jonathan into the limelight. Following this, the police decided to take a risky step and start tapping the phones of both suspects, Sabrina and Jonathan. This was done despite the lack of direct evidence pointing to their direct involvement in the murder. The police hoped that the conversations between the two could provide additional clues to the events of the day, and if they were indeed involved in the crime, it could be revealed through their conversations. At first, the tapped phone conversations didn't contain overtly criminal statements, but some details were unusual. During one conversation, Sabrina told Jonathan that the detective wanted to talk to her about her husband's murder, to which Jonathan responded in a strange and pithy way, "God, please, help us to be wise. Help Sabrina to say the right words. Please comfort her. Please give her clarity of thought." This was quite unusual, especially considering that they were essentially just discussing their reactions to the investigation without expressing any obvious signs of guilt or fear. However, their words, which addressed religious themes and included prayers, struck investigators as odd, especially in light of the fact that Robert Lemon's murder had not been solved, and the conversation itself remained essentially unclear. Police continued to examine the phone data and discovered more conversations in which Jonathan and Sabrina discussed their next steps. These conversations did not provide direct evidence of guilt, but the couple's behavior seemed odd and somewhat unnatural for people in such a stressful situation. They were clearly trying to keep their cool, but their strange conversations and constant references to religious topics seemed to the investigators to be an attempt to hide the real state of affairs. It was this excessive calmness and strange confidence in their words that began to alarm them. Thus, although suspicions began to develop, neither Sabrina nor Jonathan could yet be charged with certainty. All the clues that led investigators to them only pointed to possible involvement, but did not provide a definitive answer. They became the prime suspects, but it was important to keep working on gathering facts and evidence to eliminate all doubts. At that point, the investigators were cautious in their conclusions, realizing that it was premature to accuse people based on circumstantial evidence alone. They had a few key factors in their hands, but that evidence still didn't give a complete picture. All of this confirmed that the job was in its early stages, and more steps were needed to establish exactly who was behind Robert Lemon's murder. When the police began investigating the murder of Robert Lemon, the main task became finding concrete evidence that could link the killer to the crime. One of the first steps was to examine surveillance footage from cameras located in an industrial area near the railroad warehouse where the murder took place. The cameras captured a suspicious motorcyclist who appeared at the scene on the day of the murder. The motorcycle, as well as the man's actions, raised considerable questions for investigators, as his behavior in an area with limited access and few people was atypical. Investigators carefully analyzed the footage and determined that the motorcycle seen in the video was quite rare and unusual. Although the mere fact that the motorcyclist appeared was not enough in itself to warrant a direct accusation, it became an important landmark for further searches. Police began a check, discovering that a motorcycle similar to the one in the recording belonged to Jonathan Hearn, a 24-year-old firefighter from Tehachapi. Realizing that this motorcycle could be a key element in the investigation, investigators requested a search warrant for Jonathan Hearn's home. A search of his home and work was conducted, marking a major turning point in the case. The search was meticulously planned and involved multiple police units to ensure security and rapid evidence collection. Several items were found in Jonathan's home and workplace that could directly link him to the murder of Robert Lemon. One of the most significant finds were the large caliber firearms that were recovered from Jonathan's home. Among them were several guns matching the caliber of the weapon used in Robert's murder. Through questioning and further analysis of these weapons, investigators concluded that they may have been pre-arranged for the crime. This discovery was important evidence that Jonathan may not have just happened to be at the crime scene, but was connected to the murder on a deeper level. In addition, investigators found documents at Jonathan's workplace that also confirmed his relationship with Sabrina. This evidence not only pointed to his connection to the woman suspected of organizing the murder, but also suggested that he may have been her accomplice. This was an important point for the police, as the relationship between Jonathan and Sabrina now looked much more suspicious. Once the police had confirmation that the motorcycle did indeed belong to Jonathan, and that he had access to weapons as well as a connection to a woman whose relationship with Robert Lemon seemed increasingly strained, the investigation began to focus on him as the prime suspect. At that point, police had enough evidence to link Jonathan to the murder. On November 18, 2014, several months after Robert's murder, both Jonathan Hearn and Sabrina Lemon were arrested. Both were detained on suspicion of involvement in Robert's murder. However, at the time, insufficient evidence against Sabrina led to the charges against her being dropped. The police could not confirm her involvement in the crime, despite the existence of evidence to prove her involvement with Jonathan. However, despite the dropping of charges, the investigation continued, and investigators kept trying to find additional evidence. Meanwhile, the relationship between Sabrina and Jonathan continued to grow, but it also became even more strained. At this time, Jonathan began to experience internal conflict, realizing that the consequences of their actions could lead to the destruction of their lives. Moreover, he was pressured by the information that the investigation was bringing them closer every day to uncovering the whole truth. All of this led to Jonathan Hearn making a surprise confession in January 2017, a couple days before his court hearing. On January 6, 2017, Jonathan turned his back on Sabrina and made the decision to tell the whole truth. He agreed to make a confession that was a turning point in the investigation. In his statement, he revealed that Sabrina was the one who wanted Robert killed. According to Jonathan, she could not divorce Robert because divorce would have ruined her social standing. This statement shook up the whole case, as it not only confirmed her involvement, but also revealed her motive. Sabrina, according to Jonathan's version, could not allow her marriage to Robert to dissolve because it would jeopardize her reputation in the community, where she was praised as an example of a perfect wife and mother. After the arrest of Jonathan Hearn, who testified, police and prosecutors came to the clear conclusion that he was involved in Robert Lemon's murder. His confession was the deciding factor, and he was soon formally arrested. Jonathan explained that the murder was organized at the request of Sabrina, who could not afford a divorce because it would destroy her social status. His testimony and the evidence collected finally convinced the investigation that Sabrina was the one who initiated the crime. It took several years after Jonathan's arrest before Sabrina Lemon was apprehended. Although there was not initially enough evidence to arrest her, Jonathan's confession, as well as other evidence related to her involvement in the murder, left no doubt about her guilt. Thus, by the time she was apprehended, the investigation was already fully convinced of her role in the crime. The trial against Jonathan Hearn began in January 2017, several years after his arrest. His confession to the murder of Robert Lemon played a key role in the unfolding of the trial, but the process was not straightforward. Prosecutors and defense attorneys fought an uphill battle trying to determine Jonathan's degree of guilt and his involvement in the crime. In his confession, Jonathan stated that he committed the murder under pressure from Sabrina Lemon, who could not allow her husband to divorce her because it would destroy her social status in their community. He claimed she convinced him to help her get rid of Robert. During the trial, the prosecution adduced evidence relating to Jonathan's personal effects, including weapons found in his home and his presence at the scene of the crime as recorded by CCTV cameras. It was significant that Jonathan was not only present at the scene of the crime, but was actively involved in its preparation. Under the pressure of evidence and testimony, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, agreeing to a plea deal with prosecutors in exchange for his cooperation and assistance in convicting Sabrina Lemon. Throughout his trial, Jonathan appeared remorseful. His attorneys tried to soften his sentence, claiming that he was merely a pawn in the hands of Sabrina, who manipulated him to her advantage. Given that Jonathan agreed to cooperate with law enforcement and provide key testimony against Sabrina, the prosecution offered him a lighter sentence. Sabrina Lemon's trial began in early 2018, several years after Jonathan's arrest. She initially denied her involvement in Robert's murder, but the trial, based on Jonathan's testimony as well as the evidence gathered, was a major blow to her defense. Sabrina maintained throughout the trial that she had no part in the murder and that her relationship with Jonathan was purely personal and unrelated to the crime. However, the evidence obtained during the investigation left no doubt about her involvement in the conspiracy. The testimony of Jonathan, who claimed that she was the initiator of the murder, as well as his participation in the preparation of the crime, became the main arguments of the prosecution. The court paid special attention to motive. Sabrina, according to the prosecution, could not accept a divorce from Robert because it would undermine her reputation and social standing. Thus, motive was not only related to personal relationships, but also to social status. The testimony of Jonathan, who described how Sabrina manipulated him, proved to be the deciding factor. Despite this, Sabrina insisted on her innocence and claimed that she did not know Jonathan could go to such extreme measures. Forensic experts also pointed to her calm demeanor after the murder, which according to the prosecution was further evidence of her involvement in the crime. However, Sabrina's defense tried to argue that her behavior was simply a manifestation of shock and not evidence of guilt. On January 25, 2017, a court in Tehachapi found Jonathan Hearn guilty of committing the murder of Robert Lemon. He was found guilty of first-degree murder with mitigating circumstances for pleading guilty and cooperating with law enforcement. The court considered mitigating factors such as his confession and assistance in the conviction of Sabrina Lemon. On February 6, 2017, the court sentenced Jonathan Hearn to 25 years and 4 months in prison, including time spent in custody. On January 10, 2018, the court in Tehachapi found Sabrina Lemon guilty of murdering her husband Robert Lemon based on evidence gathered during the investigation as well as the testimony of Jonathan Hearn. The court found that her motive was to maintain her social status and avoid divorce. Despite her denials and defenses based on the lack of direct evidence of her involvement, the court found her to be a responsible organizer of the crime. On February 15, 2018, Sabrina Lemon was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of life. The court rejected her appeal in 2022, and her sentence stood. Morgan Dana Harrington was born on July 24, 1989, in the American city of Charlottesville, Virginia. She was the only child in the family, and her parents, Daniel and Judy Harrington, always tried to create a strong and stable family for their daughter. Morgan was described as a kind, open, and responsible girl with a bright sense of humor and loving to support her friends. The Harrington family was close and supported each other in every endeavor. As an only child, Morgan always found support in her parents, and it was with them that she spent a lot of time traveling and participating in family activities. Learning for Morgan was an important part of her life. She attended a local school where she was popular with her peers. One of her hobbies was sports. She ran track and was a member of the school's track team. However, apart from being physically active, Morgan was also a talented student, striving to do well in her studies. Despite her natural friendliness and charisma, she always paid attention to her success in school and took the time to study. In 2007, after graduating from high school, Morgan enrolled at the University of Virginia to study psychology. She chose this discipline because she has always been interested in people's behavior and the way they perceive the world. At university, she continued to prove herself as an ambitious and driven student, participating in various activities and always maintaining an active lifestyle. In addition to her studies, Morgan had a passion for music and traveling. She often attended concerts, followed new music bands, and was a big fan of rock music. This passion made her especially happy when she could enjoy live performances of her favorite artists. Morgan had a wide circle of friends with whom she shared her interests and loved spending time. For her, music was not just a hobby but an important part of her life, a source of inspiration and a way to express herself. October 17, 2009 was the day that would change the lives of her family and friends forever. Morgan and 3 of her close friends, including her friend Tiffany, decided to go to a Metallica concert in Charlottesville. The band Metallica was at the height of their popularity, and the event had long been something they all looked forward to. For Morgan, it wasn't just a concert, but a chance to spend an evening with friends, enjoy the music, and relax. She was excited about the upcoming event and, like many of her peers, couldn't wait to see her favorite band live. That night, the band gathered around 7 p.m. and they traveled to John Paul Jones Arena, located on the campus of the University of Virginia. Morgan, as well as her friends, felt that this was going to be a night they would all remember for a long time. The Metallica concert promised to be exciting, and the atmosphere around the arena was full of excitement and anticipation. However, it started as usual in a cheerful and carefree atmosphere. They all entered the arena, took their seats, and the concert started. Morgan was at her best, enjoying the music and socializing with her friends. But just before the start of the main show, while a warm-up act was still playing in the arena, Morgan informed her friends that she needed to use the restroom. Although there were over 18 women's restrooms in the arena itself, she suddenly decided to go outside, despite having plenty of facilities inside. It soon became clear that this decision would lead to tragic consequences. There was a strict no-return policy in place when leaving the arena, which meant that people who left the facility could not go back inside. Morgan told her friends that she was not allowed back into the venue and that she would find a way to get home. At that point, no one noticed that her words could mean more than that. She assured them that there was no need to worry and that she would make it through. At 8:48 p.m., friends tried to call her cell phone. Morgan answered, informing them that she was indeed outside the arena and by rule she was not allowed to return. She assured them that she would find a way back home, no need to worry. Those words were the last words she said to her friends. However, as time passed, Morgan never returned and her friends began to worry. Around 9:30 p.m., passing people on the street saw her for the last time. At this point, her friends began to panic when they realized that she had disappeared. This disappearance caused quite a commotion, as at first glance it was something out of the ordinary. Morgan was known for her responsible behavior and would not just disappear without explanation. Her disappearance attracted the attention of not only the locals, but also law enforcement, who immediately started searching for her. Time passed, but to no avail. That evening became fatal for Morgan, and her disappearance became a mystery requiring immediate resolution. The disappearance of Morgan Harrington, which caused a wave of anxiety and disorientation in her surroundings, was the beginning of a long and complicated investigation. When the police began their work, several versions of events immediately emerged, but at the time none of them could provide a clear answer to the question of what had actually happened to the girl. In the first hours of the disappearance, none of the explanations seemed true, as there were no key clues and no body that could shed light on the tragedy. After Morgan did not return for several hours, her friends and family contacted the police. First of all, law enforcers speculated that the girl could have just been unlucky. She could have gotten lost or lost her bearings after leaving the arena. At the time, there was no evidence of violence, and police searched for her based on the simplest of hypotheses, such as a random missing person or a possible failed attempt to find transportation home. That all changed, however, when eyewitness accounts began to come in. According to 2 eyewitnesses, Morgan was seen on a bridge near the arena in the company of 3 men. These testimonies immediately forced the investigation to focus on a more disturbing version, a possible kidnapping. It became clear that the girl could not have simply gotten lost if she was seen with people she did not know. The police began to look for connections between this fact and her subsequent disappearance. Of additional concern was the fact that Morgan had told her friends that she would be looking for a way to get home. This may have indicated that her intentions were non-violent at the time of her departure from the arena, but her continued absence became increasingly disturbing. A few days after her disappearance, Morgan's bag was found in the area where cars are parked for sporting events on the University of Virginia campus. The bag contained her documents, her cell phone with batteries removed, and other personal items. This fact added tension to the investigation, as the phone was out of battery, which could indicate an attempt to hide her location. The appearance of the bag in this location did not fit with the beliefs that it could have simply gotten lost or strayed. The bag could not have been discarded by accident. The question of what became of Morgan after her disappearance remained without a clear answer. The police continued to investigate, analyzing every piece of evidence they found. However, the absence of a body in the first weeks made it difficult to determine the exact cause of her disappearance. Standard hypotheses about accidental disappearances, robberies, or even personal motives seemed possible, but none of them could explain everything that happened 100%. It was for this reason that the investigating authorities did not jump to conclusions, but the abduction and violence theories continued to gain popularity among the police. However, everything changed when on January 26, 2010, several months after her disappearance, Morgan's body was found. The body was found in a remote area on a 742-acre, about 3 divided by 2, farm that was more than 1.5 miles from the nearest road access. The area was inaccessible and almost unremarkable, making it suitable for a hidden burial. This discovery was a key moment in the investigation. When the body was found, forensic experts began analyzing the data to determine the cause of death. Initial findings confirmed that the death was violent. What was notable was that the girl had broken bones, indicating abuse. Through analysis of the body as well as witness testimony, it was determined that Morgan had been raped. This information was later confirmed by Morgan's mother, who reported that her daughter had been raped before she died. This moment finally ruled out the version of accidental disappearance and became a turning point in the investigation. Immediately began to suspect that it was not just a crime, but the work of a maniac, a serial criminal who commits violence against women. When the body was found, the police had new data to work with. However, despite the emergence of evidence, the investigation continued to face a number of challenges. First, DNA analysis taken from the crime scene provided important information that the killer had left footprints. However, the DNA traces did not match the evidence that was already in the database. This meant that the perpetrator had not been previously apprehended. The investigation proved to be a definite challenge because, despite the evidence, the circle of suspects was too large. This meant that finding the culprit was not as easy as it seemed at first glance. Questions remained open. Was it a random perpetrator? Or was the murder linked to some personal motive? Or maybe the perpetrator was the kind of person who could hide in the shadows with no trace in the criminal database. In addition, another important piece of evidence was found in 2010, a T-shirt that belonged to Morgan. This discovery also did not provide a clear answer but brought a new element to the investigation, as the T-shirt was found in an area that was not originally connected to the place of her disappearance. As the investigation progressed in 2010, police turned their attention to another case that involved similar perpetrator behavior. In September 2005, there was a sexual assault in Fairfax, also committed on a woman. This crime was unusual in nature, with rape and violent acts similar to those found in the Morgan case. The police made a connection between the two crimes, which was an important step in the investigation. This moment made it clear that the perpetrator could be serial, which added spice to the search for his identity. However, despite all efforts, it was extremely difficult to find the perpetrator, as there was not enough evidence to infer his identity or daily life. The case of Morgan Harrington's death caught the attention of not only the locals but also the entire country. The sad tragedy, which occurred in the heart of Charlottesville, has stirred up the public and raised serious questions about safety at public events, as well as the possible threat of a serial killer who may have been operating within Virginia. The investigation and search for the killer became a national topic, and every step of the investigation was covered extensively by the media. After police were unable to quickly find the killer and identify the suspect, public anxiety only grew. Morgan was a well-known figure in Charlottesville. Her death shocked not only her family and friends but the entire university. Amid the unresolved investigation, her parents, Daniel and Judy Harrington, became active in community actions and media events, calling for a continued search for the perpetrator and better security measures. Of particular note were the parents' numerous interviews with the media, expressing their concern that the killer may have been a serial offender operating in Virginia. The security measures taken at public events began to raise questions for the parents of the dead girl, especially in the context that no specific suspects had yet been identified at the time of the murder. Harrington's parents also worried that the killer could have continued his actions elsewhere and expressed concern that such crimes could be repeated. Judy Harrington's appearances on national television shows, where she publicly stated that the killer could be a hidden maniac and that Virginia needed more measures to protect women and students, drew particular attention. She actively appealed to authorities, emphasizing the importance of better security on campuses and more security guards at public events. The mother of the victim also pressured the University of Virginia administration to take action to ensure the safety of students. Soon after the investigation dragged on and police were unable to produce a suspect, the decision was made to involve the public to help solve the crime. Charlottesville authorities, realizing how important it was to maintain public trust and mobilize people to come forward with new information, put out a reward for information that could lead to the capture of the killer. Concerned residents of the city and entire groups of University of Virginia students actively supported the investigation by distributing flyers, organizing rallies, and even participating in protests. The reward for information that could help solve the case attracted the attention of not only locals but also people across the country. Crime Stoppers, an organization dedicated to rewarding citizens for their help in investigations, offered a $100,000 reward for information that could lead to the capture of the killer. This amount was a significant incentive for many who may have been privy to some details but had not yet decided to share them with authority. An interesting addition to this appeal came from the band Metallica themselves, who were performing the night Morgan was killed. The band announced an additional $50,000 reward, thus adding another motivation for potential witnesses. This support from famous musicians made the case even more prominent in the media and helped bring attention to people who may have known something important but were hesitant to contact the police. In the months following Morgan's disappearance and murder, police conducted several major witness interviews. However, to date, all of these efforts have not resulted in a breakthrough. People who might have information about what happened to the girl were either unable to provide clear testimony or gave conflicting accounts. The police were actively working the evidence and keeping an eye out for possible suspects, but no clear suspect was identified at the time. Much time was spent analyzing and reviewing the testimony of people who had seen Morgan at the time of her disappearance. However, witnesses who claimed to have seen her with 3 men were never able to give clear descriptions that matched one specific person. By the time several months had passed since the disappearance, the investigation had virtually stalled, and investigators were unable to determine exactly who might have been responsible for the crime. In parallel, the police continued to gather new evidence, and amid growing pressure and public concern, the investigation gradually took new twists and turns. At that point, however, the crime remained unsolved, despite extensive investigative work and public engagement efforts. But in 2014, an event occurred that changed the entire picture of the investigation. Despite efforts and significant public engagement, Morgan Harrington's death remained among the unsolved crimes. In 2014, a new crime occurred that caught the attention of the investigating team. However, while it was yet to be revealed exactly how this incident related to Morgan's case, its occurrence opened up new vistas in the search for the culprit. Complex and convoluted investigative efforts that had been going on for several years suddenly began to bear fruit in 2014, when a case that seemed to have no connection to Morgan Harrington's case actually became a crucial turning point in the search for her killer. In September 2014, the case of Harrington's death was linked to the murder of another young woman, Hannah Graham, who went missing and was killed in the same city, Charlottesville. This new crime, which turned out to be similar in circumstances to Morgan's murder, led to the discovery of startling clues and uncovered years of hidden violence. On September 15, 2014, 18-year-old Hannah Graham, a student at the University of Virginia, went missing after leaving a bar in Charlottesville. She, like Morgan Harrington, found herself at the center of an investigation that quickly drew national attention. Hannah, who was enjoying a night out on the town that night, lost contact with her friends at some point. Surveillance cameras captured her walking through the streets of the city, and she was then seen on video with a man she had been socializing with. That person later turned out to be key to the investigation. Shortly after her disappearance, reports of possible signs of a kidnapping began to surface. Hannah Graham's disappearance and her tragic death drew the attention of the police and the public. It was clear that something terrible had happened. The discovery of her body the next morning 10 miles outside Charlottesville in a remote area only confirmed the worst fears. It was a murder, and it had all the hallmarks of a violent crime. As the investigation into Hannah Graham's murder continued, police began to link her disappearance to another unsolved case, the Morgan Harrington case. In a strange way, both cases had many similar elements. Both girls were murdered in Charlottesville, both were abused, and both crimes involved a mysterious disappearance after attending a social event. The investigation found that both cases involved kidnapping and violence, and in both cases the same man, Jesse Matthew, became the prime suspect. DNA analysis was a turning point in the case. Investigators working on the Hannah Graham murder investigation found DNA matches at the scene of her murder and in the death case of Morgan Harrington. This was crucial evidence that linked the two crimes. At that point, however, it was not yet clear who exactly the perpetrator might have been. Although the investigation had already decided to test all possible candidates, Jesse Matthew, a Charlottesville cab driver who was working the night Morgan went missing, was soon brought into the case. Matthew's DNA collected during the investigation turned out to match samples found in Harrington's death and Graham's murder case. In addition, police learned that Matthew had been involved in a 25 rape case in Fairfax County, further heightening suspicion against him. Police launched an investigation that brought to light disturbing facts about Jesse Matthews' past. In 2005, when he was still a student, there were 2 allegations of sexual offenses. Both incidents occurred at different universities in Virginia, where Matthew was a student. The first incident occurred at the Evangelistic Liberty University in Lynchburg, and the second at Christopher Newport University in Newport News. In both cases, the women accused Matthew of sexual harassment, but no criminal charges were filed at the time, and the allegations did not result in his arrest. Matthew was nevertheless forced to leave both institutions, which only added to the shadows on his reputation. Many details gathered about his life and background became an important element of the investigation. His behavior and stories associated with the two universities became part of the overall picture. Particularly disturbing was that after each accusation, he avoided official investigations, and his actions went unpunished. This gave even more weight to the theory that Matthew was a dangerous man who could continue his crimes while evading justice. The investigation into Morgan Harrington's death gradually began to focus on Jesse Matthew. The police questioned him, but in the first few months they could not find anything concrete except that he was indeed in Charlottesville that night and was a cab driver. However, as the investigation progressed, DNA matches to the Hannah Graham case and his past allegations of sexual misconduct led to serious suspicions. Police officers focused on his biological traces, which were found at the scene of the murders of both girls. In addition, the circumstances of his life, including 2 unsolved sexual assaults, seemed disturbing enough to put Matthew on a pedestal as a suspect. On September 15, 2015, he was formally charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping with intent to commit violence in the death of Morgan Harrington. On October 20, 2014, Jesse Matthew was formally charged with the murder of Hannah Graham. And later that month, through the efforts of investigators, a 2005 case where he was charged with attempted kidnapping in Fairfax was also added to that charge. These charges quickly led to further investigation into his connection to the Morgan Harrington case. With each new discovery, the investigation moved steadily toward the point where a murder charge against Harrington became inevitable. In 2015, Matthew was formally charged with murder and kidnapping with intent to commit violence, marking the end of a years-long investigation. He was arrested and brought to trial. After years of investigation and evidence gathering, Jesse Matthew finally found himself at the center of a trial. His crimes, committed in 2015, 2019, and 2014, were widely publicized and garnered national attention. The complex and emotionally charged trial, in which the defense and prosecution converged, was the culmination of years of investigation, and in the end, a major decision was made at trial. Jesse Matthew's trial began with a pre-trial hearing where his attorneys, in an attempt to mitigate the possible punishment, tried to argue that the defendant could not be sentenced to the most severe punishment. Matthew's lawyers argued that his actions could show signs of mental disorders, which could be taken into account as a mitigating circumstance. However, the court, after hearing the testimony of experts and the parents of both victims, left these arguments unheeded, as there were clear signs of consciousness and maliciousness of his actions. The prosecution, for its part, presented powerful evidence, including DNA matches, witness testimony, and personal testimony from the victims' parents, who detailed how their daughters' deaths changed their lives. State prosecutors particularly emphasized the fact that Jesse Matthew had already been charged with other sex crimes before he committed the murders of Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington, and that his actions were maniacal in nature. Prosecutors emphasized that his behavior was a clear sign of a serial offender and that he should receive punishment commensurate with the severity of the crimes. Matthew's defense attorneys tried throughout the trial to reduce the degree of his guilt. They argued that the defendant may have been mentally ill at the time of the crimes, which could have influenced his actions. The defense tried to challenge some of the evidence regarding DNA matches, and by citing previous criminal cases where the charges were not upheld in court, tried to build a line of defense, regardless of how hard the crime was proven, that Matthew would not have been convicted if he had been dealt with even earlier. In their speech, the defense attorneys called for a lighter sentence, citing possible personality disorder, but this failed to impress the judges. The trial concluded with Jesse Matthews' surprise decision to plead guilty to both murders. On March 2, 2016, he confessed to the murders of Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington, a significant step in the trial. This guilty plea meant that the parties came to an agreement on punishment. In exchange for the guilty plea, Jesse Matthew agreed not to appeal the sentence, which simplified the process and allowed for a quicker final verdict. As a result of the trial, on March 2, 2016, the court found Jesse Matthew guilty of the murder of Hannah Graham in 2014 and the murder of Morgan Harrington in 2009. The court also found him guilty of the rape and kidnapping of both girls. On March 2, 2016, a court in Charlottesville, Virginia, found Jesse Matthew guilty of the murders of Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington and of committing kidnapping with intent to commit violence. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. Matthew also agreed to the terms of the plea agreement, waiving his right to appeal, which meant his sentence was not subject to change, and he was to spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of release on health grounds. The judge noted that the sentencing decision was based on the seriousness of the crimes committed, as well as the defendant's guilty plea. Charles William Singer, known among acquaintances as Butch, was born in 1968 in a small town in Florida. His childhood was spent in an ordinary American family where considerable emphasis was placed on family values and work ethic. Charles was the eldest of 3 children, and although he was not an outstanding student, he was always characterized by his hard work ethic and pursuit of practical knowledge. During his school years, he was fond of sports games, especially soccer and baseball, where he showed leadership qualities and gained the respect of his peers. Despite his physical attributes and athletic success, studying was not easy for him, and he preferred to do more with his hands than sit behind books. After graduating from high school, Charles enrolled in college, but his academic career was not a long one. He soon realized that a traditional education would not be satisfying and decided to focus on practical skills. He got a job with a boat manufacturing company and then went to work at the Sea Ray Boats plant in Palm Coast, where he became a machinist and assembly specialist. This period was an important stage in his life, as Charles not only learned new skills but also made many business and personal contacts. It was here that he met his first wife and built his life. His first marriage was to a woman named Jane, with whom he lived for several years before they separated. This marriage began in the late 1980s when Charles was younger and full of ambition. However, as his blindness progressed and his health deteriorated, the relationship began to deteriorate. Jane was unable to cope with the changed dynamics of their lives, and Charles in turn found himself increasingly dependent on her. Eventually, they decided to divorce, leaving Charles alone. He was forced to adapt to the new reality, which was not easy for a man accustomed to physical labor and independence. His life before he met Dorothy Singer had been relatively peaceful, but everything changed the moment he met her. Dorothy was a middle-aged woman with an already not entirely prosperous marriage under her belt. She, like Charles, had been through several life crises, including divorce and relationship difficulties with ex-husbands. Although Dorothy was not a famous person, she was attracted to the idea of family and stability. Their meeting was the beginning of a new chapter in Charles' life. When they met, Charles, despite his disability, was still a man of strong character. Dorothy, on the other hand, was an attractive and confident woman who quickly gained his trust. They had a significant age gap, but this was no barrier to their relationship. Charles saw in Dorothy the care and attention he had lacked in recent years. Dorothy, on the other hand, admired his fortitude and desire to continue living life to the fullest despite his physical limitation. Their relationship developed rapidly, and soon they were living together. Emotional support was important to Charles, who was visually impaired, and Dorothy provided it to the fullest extent. However, despite their initial admiration for each other, their lives were not perfect. Charles' problems adjusting to his disability began to worsen, and his dependence on Dorothy increased. Charles was forced to rely on her for many things, from household management to financial matters, which became a source of tension. Dorothy, on the other hand, began to struggle in her role as a caring spouse. Although she also experienced her own personal difficulties, her tolerance for Charles's growing physical and emotional needs began to wane. As time went on, her patience wore thin, and she became increasingly irritable and dissatisfied. Quarrels between them became more and more frequent, especially when Charles felt a strong sense of powerlessness because of his disability. His behavior became increasingly irritable, and against this backdrop, Dorothy began to feel overwhelmed. Instead of finding ways to support each other, their relationship became filled with frustration and mutual recriminations. Dorothy began to complain about him to her friends and family, claiming that his dependence on her was becoming excessive. Charles, in turn, suffered from feelings of helplessness and resentment that his life was so limited. Nevertheless, despite the growing tension, they did consummate the marriage. For Charles, it was an attempt to find stability, and for Dorothy, a chance to create a new family arrangement. However, the marriage was soon jeopardized and the problems between them began to pile up. With each passing year, their life together became more and more difficult. Charles felt more and more dependent on his wife, and Dorothy was less and less able to tolerate this dependence. Their lives could not help but reflect the difficult questions they faced. How to balance caring for a sick person with maintaining their own well-being. Dorothy was increasingly dissatisfied and made no secret of the emotional and physical strain she was under. This was set against a backdrop of growing quarrels and resentment, which only intensified with each passing year. The tragic moment in their lives came when Charles disappeared. The relationship between the couple had reached its breaking point, and the growing tension probably played a part in the event. When his sister failed to receive the usual messages from him and noticed that her correspondence with him had become unusual, she became concerned. On March 23, 2017, concerned about his disappearance, she filed a missing persons report with the police, which was the beginning of an investigation that would soon reveal the horrific circumstances. After Charles Singer's sister reported him missing to the police on March 23, 2017, investigative efforts began by interviewing Charles's colleagues at work. It turned out that he had not shown up for work since February 8-9, which seemed strange to the police as it was quite a long absence. His co-workers could not explain why Charles was not at work or in contact with them. This made the investigators suspicious, and they decided to investigate further, starting with an inspection of the house. The police went to the house where Charles lived with Dorothy. The house was located in the village of Bunnell, and at first glance it looked ordinary, no different from any other house in the area. When the investigators went inside, they immediately noticed that the house was neatly cleaned. This attracted attention because, according to Charles's relatives and acquaintances, his life was not particularly routine, and the house probably should have had some traces of ordinary home life. In addition, there were other items in the house that might have been of significance to the investigation. Among them were recently purchased cleaning supplies and packages of mothballs, which was not significant evidence, but prompted investigators to speculate as to what they had recently been purchased for. Did Dorothy want to clean the house after her husband left to start a new life? Or was she trying to cover some traces? At that point, it was uncertain as to their connection to Charles' disappearance. Such items could have been used for many different purposes, and at this stage the investigation did not conclude that they were necessarily connected to the disappearance. After inspecting the house, the investigators interviewed Dorothy Singer. She was the only person who was thought to be able to provide an explanation for Charles's disappearance. Dorothy testified that there had been an argument between her and Charles. According to her, the quarrel arose because Charles had put her in a corner, and she felt that she could no longer tolerate his behavior. At one point, according to her account, Charles raised his hand at her, which was a defining moment for her. Dorothy claimed that after this altercation, she gave Charles an ultimatum. Either he would leave the house or she would report him to the police. She added that Charles packed up his personal belongings, took his phone, money, and his family debit card, and left the house. There were many details in her story that looked logical at first glance, but investigators began to notice that some points didn't quite match up with what was actually happening. For example, Dorothy claimed that Charles left the house and took all of his belongings with him, but investigators noted that there was no report of his whereabouts or any action on his part after that. Although Dorothy seemed calm, her testimony began to raise suspicions among investigators. They began to note that some of her statements were not entirely consistent with what they could observe at the scene. The house had been cleaned, but had it remained that way throughout the weeks Charles had been out of contact? This prompted police to further verify her statement and investigate any possible contradictions. Investigators decided to continue their investigation, checking for any details that could shed light on what happened. The ambiguities in Dorothy's story led them to investigate the house more thoroughly and pay attention to all the little details that could be a clue. At this point, however, the investigation did not yet have enough evidence to draw definitive conclusions about what had happened. At this stage, the investigation was just beginning. The police continued to gather information and verify details that could shed light on the disappearance of Charles Singer. The house, its contents, and Dorothy Singer's testimony became the main points of further investigation. With each minute, each new step of the investigation, the questions became more and more complex, and each new fact required careful analysis. After the initial interrogation of Dorothy Singer and a tour of their shared home, the investigation was left with questions that needed to be scrutinized. Officially, Charles Singer had been reported missing, and the task of the police at this stage was to determine whether he had indeed left the house voluntarily, as his wife claimed, or whether there was a more serious situation at hand. The first action that investigators resorted to was to reconstruct Charles' travel route after his alleged departure. To do so, the police decided to check his cell phone location data, as well as record financial activity on his bank cards. A prompt request to telecommunications companies allowed the investigation to access information on Charles' cell phone movements. Given that, according to Dorothy, he left for another city to start a new life, it was expected that his device would have left the county at least once. However, data obtained from the carriers gave the opposite picture. For several weeks, starting in early February, Charles' cell phone never left Flagler County. Moreover, it was consistently detected within the same sector of the network, which encompassed the Singer family's neighborhood. On several occasions, the device was detected in close proximity to the very house where Dorothy lived. None of the signals associated with this suite indicated crossing county lines or traveling out of state. For investigators, this was the first alarm bell that cast doubt on the credibility of the missing man's spouse's word. While the phone's location cannot be definitive proof of the owner's physical presence, its repeated activity in the same area suggested that the device either had not left the area or was in the hands of another person. This fact was the basis for further analyzing Charles's other forms of activity after his alleged departure from the house. Additional food for thought for the investigation was provided by information from Charles' sister. In the course of repeated communication with the police, she reported that for several weeks she had received text and voice messages from her brother. However, their content seemed unusual to her. The main oddity consisted of spelling errors and broken punctuation. Her brother was known to be completely blind and used the voice dial function on his phone. This allowed him to formulate messages verbally, after which the system automatically converted them into text. Thanks to this, his messages were usually well composed, without unnecessary typos, with a clear structure and accurate transmission of thoughts. But since February, in the correspondence began to appear strange deviations. Words were often misspelled. There were phrases that sounded unnatural for Charles. In some messages felt uncertainty which had not been observed before. This reinforced her sister's suspicions that someone else might be writing on Charles' behalf, trying to imitate his communication style. There were no voice calls, video calls, or face-to-face meetings. Communication was limited to text messages only. These observations were recorded in the interview transcripts and added to the case file. The next step was to investigate Charles' financial activity. Dorothy claimed that her husband had left home, taking with him his cell phone, personal items, and a debit card from a joint bank account. To confirm or deny this information, investigators contacted the bank that handled the Singer family account. It was clear from the bank statement that Charles' card continued to be used even after he left the house. Transactions for small amounts at convenience stores such as grocery chains, hardware stores, and pharmacies were recorded. One interesting point was that all purchases were made within the same neighborhood where the Singer home was located. Not a single transaction was made outside of the neighborhood, despite claims of relocation. To the investigators, this became another cause for doubt. If the man had indeed moved away, at least some of the transactions should have taken place in other geographic locations. In addition, given that it was a debit card, it was assumed that it was either used by Charles himself or someone with access to it. Having obtained details of when and where specific purchases were made, police made inquiries at a number of retail outlets where card activity had been recorded. The task of the investigation was to establish who exactly made purchases on the dates and hours indicated on the account statement. Store administrators were provided with surveillance video footage that covered the checkout areas and entrances to the premises. The footage was seized and sent for analysis. Reviewing the videos took time, but it was essential to confirm or deny whether Charles had actually used his card as his wife claimed. At this stage, the investigation made no official statements, limiting itself to an internal analysis of the information gathered. However, even before the completion of the study of the video recordings, investigators began to suspect that the version of Charles' voluntary departure from the house was increasingly losing credibility. By this point, the investigation had progressed significantly. Initially dealing with a missing persons report, investigators now had a number of facts that needed serious verification. Inconsistencies in Dorothy's story, Charles's unconfirmed actions after he left, his phone and card activity, and physical evidence in the house all indicated that the picture of what had happened was more complicated than it appeared at first glance. A key turning point in the investigation into Charles Singer's disappearance was the results of analyzing video footage obtained from stores that had previously recorded his bank card activity. Investigators obtained footage from surveillance cameras covering the checkout areas and scrutinized each piece corresponding to the time and location of the transactions. The footage from several cameras clearly showed Dorothy Singer. It was she who made purchases, paying for them with the same card, which, according to her, was taken by Charles when he allegedly left the house. The recording of Dorothy's use of the card was strong evidence that her testimony was unreliable. This discovery caused the investigators to revisit the house and continue their search of the property and grounds. The goal was specific: to find direct evidence that Charles's personal belongings, including his cell phone and bank card, had never actually left the confines of the house. On April 7, 2017, police again arrived at the Pine Tree Lane home to conduct a second search. Particular attention was paid to areas that may have previously been overlooked: outbuildings, sheds, basements, and the street area. On this day, a new and extremely important piece of evidence was discovered: a firearm. The gun was in the house, in a box of household goods, and on first inspection it was thought might not have attracted attention. Now it was seized as an item subject to forensic analysis. The gun found was sent to a laboratory for forensic analysis. Specialists checked it for traces of use, matching casings and bullets, and also tried to identify fingerprints. The results of the examination showed that the weapon had been used recently. There were traces of gunpowder gases on the inner part of the barrel, and the muzzle bore the remains of fouling characteristic of the shot. This indicated that the gun had not just been kept in the house, but had been used for its intended purpose relatively recently. However, no fingerprints could be found on it. The grip and other surfaces of the gun had been thoroughly cleaned, or did not contain sufficient skin oils to permit identification. While the lack of prints did not directly link the gun to anyone living in the house, the fact that it was used became key. At the time, the investigation did not yet have access to Charles's body and did not have the ability to match the gun to a specific violent act. However, the mere presence of a loaded and recently used gun in the home of a man reported missing raised obvious questions. 4 days after the second search, on April 11, 2017, investigators discovered something that definitively changed the direction of the investigation. While exploring the property, especially the backyard and areas hidden from public view, an old aluminum boat, a so-called John boat, upside down and located in the back of the lot behind the house, caught the attention of police. Underneath it was a hastily assembled sheltered area. On top was piled wood chips, old boards, polyethylene, and garden debris. pulling back the layer of cover revealed a camouflage tarp wrapped around a large object. Inside was a body wrapped in a pillow, blanket, and thick cloth. A box of mothballs was placed nearby, probably to mask the odor. Forensics quickly determined that the body found was that of Charles Singer. The degree of decomposition was consistent with the time frame of the disappearance, about 2 months. This clearly refuted the theory that Charles had left the house voluntarily. The body was within the property, which had been under Dorothy's control all along. The coroner's office proceeded to determine the cause of death. During the examination, 5 gunshot wounds were noted, 4 in the head area and 1 in the chest. Comparative ballistic analysis between the gun found on April 7 and bullet channels in the body of Charles showed a complete match. It was the gun that was used in the shooting. Thus, the connection between the gun found and Charles' body was documented and scientifically confirmed. After the discovery of the body, the police began round-the-clock surveillance of Dorothy Singer. Investigators already had probable cause to believe she was involved in the incident. In addition, intelligence information indicated that Dorothy may have been taking steps to escape, especially in the face of increasing police pressure. She was recorded moving around the neighborhood, collecting belongings, and having contact with individuals outside of her normal social circle. On November 20, 2017, 7 months after the discovery of the body, the Flagler County Task Force, in cooperation with St. John's colleagues, apprehended Dorothy Singer on State A1A as she drove out of the county. The apprehension occurred without resistance. Personal belongings, documents, cash, and necessities were found in her vehicle, all indicating that she was in preparation to flee. After being apprehended, she was taken to the St. John's County Jail and then extradited back to Flagler County, where she was formally charged. After Dorothy Singer was arrested and the initial investigative phase was completed, the evidence collected was turned over to the Flagler County Prosecutor's Office. The indictment included numerous counts, among which the key charge was first-degree murder. The amount of evidence was substantial. Video footage, evidence of Charles' bank card uses after his disappearance, phone location data, ballistics on the recovered weapon, and forensic evidence of the body. The prosecutor's office insisted that the murder was premeditated and committed with intent, followed by an attempt to cover up the crime. Therefore, the case was referred to the jury and the official trial began. The trial was held in the Flagler Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Dennis Craig. The trial was accompanied by media and public attention. The trial itself began in May 2019. Representatives of the prosecution presented to the court all the materials collected during the investigation. Images from the place where the body was found, expert reports, records of interrogations, bank statements, as well as video from surveillance cameras. Particular attention was paid to the expert opinion on the weapon. The criminalists presented to the court a ballistic report which proved the coincidence between the found gun and the wounds recorded on the body of Charles Singer. They also heard testimony from store employees whose cameras recorded Dorothy using her husband's card. The defense, for its part, tried to present the events in a different light. Dorothy's lawyers insisted that the incident could have occurred in self-defense or in an emotional outburst, without premeditated intent. In addition, the defense side emphasized the long history of domestic conflicts between the spouses, arguing that Charles could have exerted psychological and physical pressure on Dorothy, which allegedly provoked the tragedy. However, evidence gathered by the prosecutor's office strongly suggested that after Charles Singer disappeared, Dorothy not only failed to report him missing, but actively created the illusion that he was alive, using his phone, bank cards, and sending messages to his relatives on his behalf. The court also took into account the fact that Charles's body had been deliberately hidden in a disguised grave in the grounds of the house, indicating an attempt to cover up evidence of the crime. The trial lasted 5 days. Prosecution and defense witnesses testified, all necessary materials were presented, and then the court retired to render a decision. On May 24, 2019, the Flagler Circuit Court found Dorothy Singer guilty of first-degree murder. On May 28, 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, that decision was subsequently reconsidered. In November 2019, the defense appealed, citing a procedural violation committed by the judge during the first trial. Specifically, Judge Dennis Craig refused to adjourn the hearing, despite the prosecution submitting a key new piece of evidence: DNA testing, less than 2 weeks before the trial. The Court of Appeal found that the refusal to reschedule affected the completeness of the defense's preparation and thus violated the defendant's right to a fair trial. On November 22, 2019, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the first instance verdict and ordered a new trial. The case was assigned to a new judge, Terrence Perkins, who scheduled a retrial for May 18, 2020. However, due to temporary court closures caused by pandemic restrictions, the preliminary hearing was repeatedly postponed. In preparation for the second trial, Dorothy Singer took a plea deal with the prosecution. She agreed to a guilty plea in exchange for a reclassification of the charge from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. This move avoided a new jury trial and moved the case into the sentencing phase. On May 4, 2020, the Flagler Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Terrence Perkins, found Dorothy Singer guilty of second-degree murder. On the same day, she was sentenced to 32.5 years in prison, at least 25 years of which she must serve without the possibility of parole. That sentence became final. Nahir Galarza was born on September 11, 1998 in Argentina. Her childhood was spent in a family where discipline and order came first. Her father, Marcelo Galarza, served in the police force. Her mother, Ivite Villalba, took care of the house. Nahir grew up an obedient child, tried not to cause problems to her parents, did well in school, and from childhood dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Her beauty and self-confidence attracted attention, and on social media she seemed happy and carefree. After high school, she went to university to study law. Her parents were sure that their daughter would have a successful future, but behind the perfect picture there were doubts, fears, and insecurities. Fernando Pastorizo was born on August 25, 1997. Unlike Nahir, his family was not so prosperous. His parents divorced when he was young, and although he kept in contact with both, his upbringing was mostly handled by his mother, Silvia Mantegazza. She worked to support her son and tried to give him everything he needed. Fernando was an ordinary boy, not an excellent student, but not a bully either. He loved motorcycles, often rode through the streets of the city, and dreamed of freedom. Unlike Nahir, he did not go to university, but tried to find himself in life, worked part-time, and did not make long-term plans. They met when Nahir was 15 and Fernando was 16. They lived in the same city and their families knew each other, but first really got to know each other through mutual friends. At first they just texted each other, exchanging jokes, discussing music and movies. Fernando was attentive and caring, and Nahir liked his charm. Their friendship quickly grew into something more. Their relationship was not easy. They often broke up and got back together again. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they didn't speak for weeks. But they always came back to each other. It was a typical teenage romance, stormy, passionate, but not always stable. The last year of their relationship was particularly difficult. They argued more often than before, began to hide their feelings from each other. Fernando told his friends he was tired of the swinging, and Nahir became more and more withdrawn. The clock showed around midnight when Nahir Galarza dialed Fernando Pastorizo. Her voice was steady, but there was some tension in her words. She asked to meet. Fernando didn't argue. Perhaps he thought this was just a normal conversation, another reconciliation, another attempt to sort out their complicated relationship. Fernando rode up to her house on his moped. He looked calm in the dark, but perhaps deep down something told him. They rode through the deserted streets. The light of the street lamps cast long shadows on the asphalt. The city was asleep. There were no cars or passers-by. Only the rustle of tires on the road and the occasional barking of dogs broke the silence. They were talking. About what now no one will never know. Perhaps it was a conversation about the past, about the days when everything was simple and carefree. Or maybe they were talking about the future, which now seemed so uncertain. Or maybe it was a goodbye conversation. an attempt to close old wounds. And then the first shot rang out. A sharp pop broke the silence of the night. Fernando jerked forward. His body tensed, his fingers frantically gripped the handlebars of the There was a second of silence. The bullet struck Fernando in the chest. He didn't move again. A man woke up in a nearby house. He thought he heard a strange sound. At first, he thought it was a firecracker, but something inside told him it was no ordinary pop. He got out of bed, went to the window and froze. There was a guy lying on the dark road next to an overturned moped. For a few seconds, he just stared. Maybe it had been an accident? Maybe the young man had just passed out? But something was wrong. The man picked up his cell phone and dialed the emergency number. "I heard gunshots. There's a guy here. He's not moving." As he spoke to the operator, the street remained empty. Sirens cut through the silence of the nighttime city, breaking the darkness with flashing lights. An ambulance was the first to arrive. The car door creaked open and two paramedics swiftly emerged. They walked toward the body, treading carefully on the damp asphalt, careful not to step on the footprints scattered around them. One of them bent down, checked the pulse on the young man's neck, then looked at the other and nodded briefly. There was no life in him. The second medic exhaled quietly and looked at the moped piled on its side next to the body, then shifted his gaze to the blood-stain spreading across the road. It was obvious. The guy had died instantly. There was no attempt to call for help, no struggle, no agony. Two precise shots, both fatal. While the paramedics were recording the time of death, the police arrived on the scene. Several officers stepped out of the car. Ahead of them walked Detective Alberto Morales, a man with a cold stare and measured movements. He took a quick glance around the scene, noting the key details: the body, the moped, the pool of blood that had begun to slowly drip toward the curb. Looking up, he noticed that the street was empty. The windows of the nearest houses were dark, which meant that either the occupants were fast asleep or no one wanted to interfere. He moved closer and looked at the young man lying on the ground. The body was motionless. The skin was already starting to pale. There were two gunshots visible on the body. If this was a robbery, the shots would have been different. What if it was someone who knew the victim? He shifted his gaze to his men and said briefly, "We need to check the pockets." The officers began the search. In the jacket pocket they found a cell phone, some cash, keys. No wallet, no ID, no weapon. The detective frowned. If this had been a robbery, the perpetrator would probably have taken something of value. But the cell phone was still there. So this wasn't a random street raid. Then what is it? He lifted his head and looked to the end of the street. No witnesses. The officers continued their inspection. One of them picked up the moped, examined its body, checked the glove compartment, but it was empty. The gas tank was half full and the keys were still in the ignition. The detective ran his fingers along the steering wheel and noticed that the victim's arms had weakened abruptly before falling, with no attempt to hold on. So the first shot occurred while the guy was still on the moped. Morales looked closely at the position of the body. The second one was probably fired after the fall, the kill shot. He straightened up and looked around. Murder weapon? No, not in the bushes, not near the bike, not within sight. So it had either been taken with him or thrown away. He called in one of the officers. "Bring up the ballistics team, have them survey the area." The officer nodded and stepped back to make the call. While the police secured the crime scene, the detective made his first theories. Robbery ruled out. That left either a contract killing or a personal hate crime. He looked at the moped. If the perpetrator wanted to hide his motives, he could have taken the bike, or at least some of his personal belongings, to give the impression of an attack. But everything's still there. Then it wasn't a robbery. He took another look at the body. Someone wanted to make sure the guy was dead. Someone had fired without hesitation. He crouched down next to the body and looked at the dead man's face. His eyes were open, his frozen gaze staring upward. He didn't realize what had happened in the first few seconds. Perhaps he hadn't even had time to be frightened. The detective stood up and turned to his men. "We need to find out who he is. Pull up his ID. Find family, friends, Morales glanced around the street again. He didn't like this place. Quiet, empty, deserted. If the killer wanted to avoid witnesses, he'd picked the right time. But then why here? Why not somewhere else? The detective wondered. Perhaps this place had significance. Either the victim had been brought here on purpose, or he had come on his own. In either case, the killer knew what he was doing. The ballistics car pulled up quickly. 3 specialists got out, one of whom was already putting on gloves in preparation for work. They nodded silently to the detective and immediately began their examination. After a couple minutes, one of them turned to Morales. 2 shots. I can't determine the caliber yet, but judging by the nature of the wounds, the weapon was compact, probably a pistol. Short range, the killer was very close. The detective nodded. That meant it wasn't fired from cover or from afar. The attack wasn't sudden, it was planned. While ballistics continued their work, the officers checked the nearby houses. Most of the residents were already asleep, but there were some who heard sounds. One man said he thought he heard firecrackers going off, but when he looked out the window, all he saw was a motorcycle and a guy lying on the ground. There was no one else around. The detective looked at the crime scene again. It looked like the killer had vanished into the night. But it doesn't work that way. There are always traces left behind. Morales took a deep breath. Now it was up to him to figure out who might have wanted the young man dead. He glanced at the dead man's cell phone, which one of the officers was holding. Text messages, calls, recent contacts, all of it could provide clues. Time to reach out to family and friends. Time to figure out who this guy was and who he might have been bothering. The investigation was gaining momentum, but so far the police hadn't found any obvious motive for the murder. They started with the simplest of tasks, interviewing Fernando Pastorizo's family and friends. If the crime was related to personal animosity or revenge, it could be reflected in his environment, behavior in recent days, possible conflicts or strained relationships. The first people questioned were the parents of the deceased. Silvia Mantagazza, his mother, met the investigators in a state of deep sorrow, but firmly stated that her son was not associated with criminal groups, was not involved in illegal activities, and had no enemies who might want him dead. She reiterated that Fernando was an ordinary young man who liked to ride his moped, go out with friends, and spend time with his girlfriend. Fernando's father, Gustavo Pastorizo, confirmed these words, adding that his son had never been in serious trouble. The parents did not believe the murder could have been criminally related. The police then approached the friends of the deceased. None of them could say anything that would indicate a possible motive for the crime. They all said the same thing. Fernando was a good guy, calm, non-confrontational, but in recent months he had seemed really tense. Some recalled that he avoided talking about his relationship and tried not to touch the subject if anyone brought it up. However, it didn't seem like something threatening. More like the usual problems in his personal life that many young people go through. The police analyzed the financial transactions of the deceased, checked his activity in social networks, but found nothing suspicious. He did not own large sums of money, had no debts or unexpected expenses. All his movements and contacts looked normal. The theory that he might have been killed because of debts or criminal disputes became irrelevant. While the police were gathering information, the next morning the ballistic examination provided the first official results. Forensic experts determined that the murder was committed at close range. First shot to the back, second shot to the chest. This indicated that the attacker was close to the victim, and after the fall, Fernando fired a control shot. Both shots were fired from a 9mm caliber pistol. This caliber was common among gun owners, both civilians and police officers. The murder weapon was not found at the scene, which meant that the killer deliberately took it with him. This indicated that the perpetrator did not act on impulse, but had probably thought out a plan in advance. The police did not yet have a clear idea of who the attacker might have been. Soon, new information came in. In social networks, there was a message that attracted the attention of the investigation. In the afternoon, a few hours after the publication of the forensic data, social media activity came to the attention of the police. Nahir Galarza, Fernando's girlfriend, posted a photo of them together. This post was noticed not only by friends of the deceased but also by investigators. The photo was accompanied by a short comment, "I will love you always, my angel." The message aroused the interest of the police but did not become a basis for suspicion. Such postings in the wake of tragedies were not unusual. Many people losing loved ones shared their feelings on social media. However, the investigators recorded this fact as it could play a role in the future. At this stage of the investigation, Nahir was not considered a suspect. She was the girlfriend of the deceased and therefore one of the key witnesses. The police decided to gather more information about her. While checking her background, investigators found out that her father, Marcelo Galarza, was a police officer. His personnel file showed that he had a service weapon registered with the police. So far, it was just a coincidence, but the fact that the murder weapon matched a typical police pistol got the detective thinking. If the killer had used such a gun, it could mean two things. Either the perpetrator had access to an official gun, or the gun had been acquired illegally, making the search more difficult. At this point, the police could not build specific charges. However, there was a new lead in the case that needed to be followed up. The investigation continues. So far, the police had no clear idea which direction to take. The attacker had left no trace. No one had seen the moment of the murder, and Fernando himself was not connected to crime or anything that could lead to such a brutal massacre. Investigators had to figure out, was the murder carefully planned, or was it an outburst of emotion? Why didn't the perpetrator steal anything if it was an assault? And most importantly, who could have been so close to the victim to shoot twice and yet disappear without leaving a single piece of evidence behind? In the evening of the same day, while the police were still trying to reconstruct the picture of Fernando Pastorizo's murder, something happened that no one expected. Nahir Galarza came to the station. She looked calm but a little tense. She asked to see the investigators and said she wanted to confess. When Detective Alberto Morales heard about this, he first thought it was some kind of mistake. So far, there was no direct evidence in the case that would point to her. However, the girl was confident in her decision and wasn't going to keep quiet. When she sat down in front of the investigators, the atmosphere in the room changed. Everyone expected a shocking statement, but what came out of her mouth exceeded expectations. She said she had shot Fernando. Nahir spoke calmly. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't try to humor or change the subject. She claimed that Fernando was a violent man, that he had been abusing her for a long time, that he used physical force. According to her, he beat her. And on the day of their last meeting, she feared for her life. She said Fernando could snap at any minute. His behavior was unpredictable, and the last time they met, his aggression was out of control again. That's why she took a gun to protect herself if he tried to hit her. In her version, as they rode on the moped, he started yelling at her, grabbing her arms, and she realized she had to act. That's when she drew her gun and fired. At first, the police listened carefully to what she said. If her story checked out, it could explain a lot. Maybe it wasn't a planned murder, just self-defense. But the further the questioning went, the more inconsistencies emerged. The first thing that raised doubts among the investigators was the absence of any signs of beatings on Nahir's body. If she had indeed been beaten, there should have been bruises, abrasions or bruises on her skin, especially if she was grabbed while riding a moped. However, the doctors who examined her found none of these. The second important point is the nature of the murder. If Fernando had indeed attacked her while driving, how was she able to pull out a gun, aim, and hit him in the back? It didn't make sense. Investigators asked her another question. Why was the second shot fired? If the first shot was an act of self-defense, it would be logical to expect Nahir to try to run away, call for help or an ambulance, but instead, she fired another shot in the chest when Fernando was already on the ground and weakened. The police knew that a control shot is rarely an accident. It signifies a determination to see the case through to the end. The more questions the investigators asked, the less convincing Nahir's version looked. The investigators began fact-checking her words. They found that she had never previously reported abuse by Fernando. There had been no complaints, no contact with the police, not even a hint of such allegations. In addition, friends and acquaintances of the couple had never noticed any physical violence between them. They argued, could raise their voices at each other, but no one had ever seen bruises on Nahir or signs of struggle on Fernando's body. All this was in favor of the theory that Nahir was lying or trying to cover up the real reasons for the murder. While the interrogations were going on, investigators continued to examine the CCTV footage. Initially, it appeared that there were no cameras on the street where the murder took place that could capture the moment of the shooting. However, after several hours, they were able to find footage that turned out to be very important to the case. One of the cameras located near the crime scene managed to capture the moment when Nahir Galarza was returning home after the murder. When investigators viewed the footage, they were surprised. If this had been a crime of passion or an act of self-defense, it would be logical to expect that Nahir would have looked frightened, might have run or looked around for fear of repercussions. However, the footage showed the opposite. She walked calmly, did not look back, did not make any sudden movements. Her gait was confident, as if she was just returning home after an ordinary walk. This moment radically contradicted her version of the story. If she really killed Fernando in fear and self-defense, why did she just leave the scene? Investigators asked Nahir another key question. If her version was true, why didn't she call an ambulance? If she didn't intend to kill Fernando, why didn't she try to help him after the first shot? She didn't call for help, she didn't call anyone, she didn't stay at the scene. Instead, she just went home and the next day posted on social media as if nothing had happened. Her behavior didn't fit the reaction of someone who had just survived an assault and had to defend herself. It looked like cold-blooded, premeditated murder, and then trying to make it look like self-defense. The police now had a clear picture. 2 shots fired at close range, the second a test shot, no attempt to call an ambulance. A steady gait on the way home, no sign of panic. Nahir claimed she was afraid of Fernando but could not explain how he could have attacked her while driving a moped. She said she wanted to defend herself but fired another shot when he was already wounded. The police finally concluded that it was premeditated murder and that the self-defense theory was just an attempt to avoid punishment. By the time the interrogation came to an end, the police had no doubt Nahir Galarza would be arrested. Her confession made it inevitable, and numerous inconsistencies undermined her defense. That night, she was officially taken into custody. The police informed her that she would be brought to trial and that her case would then be treated as premeditated murder. After Nahir Galarza's arrest, her case caused a storm of public interest. The whole of Argentina followed the court proceedings, and the media discussed every detail of the crime. The question on everyone's mind was it really self-defense as the defendant claimed, or premeditated murder committed in cold blood? The prosecutor's office took a hard line from the beginning. 2 shots fired at close range, one of which was a control shot, spoke for themselves. Also alarming was Nahir's behavior after the murder. No attempt to help, leaving the scene, calmly returning home, posting on social media the next morning. None of this was consistent with the behavior of a person acting in a state of fear or affect. Prosecutors said that the crime was committed deliberately, and the defense version that Nahir put forward does not stand up to criticism. Nahir initially admitted that she shot Fernando because he was violent toward her. She stated that she had endured beatings and insults for a long time, but that night, fear for her life made her take the gun. Fernando became aggressive, she said, and she had to defend herself. But when the trial began, her testimony changed dramatically. She now claimed that the murder was an accident. According to her new version, the gun accidentally went off in her pocket while she was sitting behind Fernando on the moped. She said she didn't even immediately realize what had happened. Then, when they fell off the moped, she raised the gun to realize what had happened, at which point the gun accidentally fired a second time, hitting Fernando in the chest. This account was strikingly different from her original confession. Now she completely denied the premeditated nature of the crime and tried to portray herself as the victim of a tragic accident. But the court had too many questions. The court did not accept Nahir's explanation. First, the experts examined her new statement and said that the gun could not have accidentally fired twice. The gun that was fired was in good working order, and an involuntary discharge was ruled out. Secondly, if the shot was fired in the pocket, the fabric of the clothes should have traces of gunpowder gases, but the expert examination did not find any such traces. The third major argument against Nahir concerned the second shot. The experts and the prosecutor's office argued it was a control shot. If the gun had actually fired accidentally at the moment she raised it, the bullet could have hit anywhere, but it struck Fernando in the chest. This spoke of a purposeful action. Also, the judges couldn't understand her behavior after the incident. If it was an accident, why did she just leave without calling an ambulance? Why didn't she call the police? Why didn't she even try to explain the situation to Fernando's family? Detectives also presented surveillance video of Nahir walking home confidently after the murder. If it were an accident, you'd expect her to cry, panic, run, but the footage showed a calm and confident gait. These facts shattered her defense. The judges concluded that her behavior was not consistent with that of a person who was in shock from a tragedy. Throughout the trial, Nahir's defense tried to acquit her, but numerous inconsistencies, contradictory testimony, and ballistic expertise did their job. There was a tense silence in the courtroom on the day of the verdict announcement. Fernando's parents waited for justice. Friends of the victim listened to the last word of the judge with bated breath. On July 3, 2018, the court of Gualeguaychú, Entre Rios province, found Nahir Galarza guilty of the premeditated murder of Fernando Pastorizo. On July 6, 2018, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Emily Sarah Aberly Murray was born on February 19, 1980, in the town of Slippery Hollow, New York, but spent most of her life in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Her parents, Thomas and Cynthia Murray, were a loving, intelligent couple who instilled in their daughter a passion for knowledge, independence, and the pursuit of goodness. There was always a warm atmosphere in the family. Emily loved listening to her father talk about philosophy and theology, and her mother taught her to see the beauty in caring for others. From childhood, she took a keen interest in the world around her, participated in church activities, and often helped out at the local parish. During her school years, she was drawn to the humanities, especially philosophy, and so when it came time to choose her future profession, she firmly decided to devote herself to serving people and becoming a minister in the Episcopal Church. At Kenyon College, one of the oldest liberal arts colleges in the United States, she studied philosophy. An excellent student, an activist, a person with amazing kindness, she easily found a common language with others and often became the center of any company. Classmates recalled that next to her there was a feeling of warmth and support. Her laughter was ringing and sincere. She loved to travel and dreamed that one day she would preach in the ancient cathedrals of Europe. Once she even went to Oxford for a semester, where she immersed herself in the study of philosophy and theology, walking the cobbled streets of the ancient city and being inspired by its history. Like many students, she needed money for everyday expenses, so she took a job as a waitress at Pirates Cove, a local restaurant just 100 yards from her dormitory. She worked there for a few months, and it was there that she met Gregory McKnight. He was a few years older than her, worked in the kitchen, and hadn't attracted much attention at first. Tall, sturdy, with a quiet voice and an impenetrable expression, he kept to himself. But sometimes he was unexpectedly friendly. Emily never paid much attention to him, but colleagues said he was particularly attentive to her. At one point, he even stood up for her when one of the employees flirted with her too insistently, after which he became even more withdrawn. On the evening of November 2, 2000, Emily finished her last shift at Pirates Cove. She decided to quit her job to focus on her studies. It was a momentous day. Her friends decided to come to the restaurant to celebrate her leaving. They sat at tables, joking around, remembering funny stories about her work, promising to come here even without her, just to drop in for a cup of coffee once in a while, and reminisce about the evenings they spent together. Emily laughed, saying she would probably miss this place. Even the old coffee machine that was always breaking down and the endless orders from customers who didn't know what they wanted. The guests started to leave around midnight, and Emily stayed until closing time, helping to clean tables and count the cash register. The bartender, Nathaniel Justice, remembered that at about 3 a.m. she was still in the lounge looking for her keys. He joked that maybe they had decided to hide so she couldn't leave. But Emily only grinned. Then she walked out, saying that she had another full year of college ahead of her and that now that she was free from work, she'd have more time for her friends. Nathaniel gave her a look, watching her disappear out the door. and that was the last time anyone who knew her saw her. She was expected at the party, but she never showed up. Her friends didn't pay much attention to it at first, thinking she was tired and had just gone to bed. But when she didn't show up for class in the morning and didn't answer a single phone call, concern began to grow. First, one of them ran to her dormitory, but she wasn't there. Her bed was neatly made and her wallet with her credit cards and driver's license was on the table next to it. The car was nowhere to be found. They started calling everyone who might have seen her, but no one knew where she might have gone after work. By late afternoon, the anxiety had become almost panicky. Emily never disappeared without warning. She always left notes, always let everyone know where she would be. Not showing up to a party, not calling her parents, it wasn't like her. The girl seemed to disappear into the night, leaving behind only silence and anxious anticipation. The morning of November 3 began with an alarm. Emily Murray did not show up for any of her lectures, did not answer any of her phone calls, and her absence could no longer be explained as an accident. Emily's friend Loretta Frost, one of the first to worry the night before, went to her dorm again, hoping it was all just a ridiculous misunderstanding. The car was nowhere to be found, which meant that wherever she went, she did it in her Subaru Outback. By noon, worried friends gathered in Loretta's room. Worry gradually turned to panic. Some tried to convince themselves that Emily had simply decided to go into seclusion, while others found this theory unconvincing. She couldn't just pick up and disappear, leave her belongings behind, not even taking her wallet. If she wanted a break from everyone, at least she would have warned someone. The more they thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Someone suggested calling her parents in New York. It wasn't an easy decision. No one wanted to scare Thomas and Cynthia Murray in vain, but the situation demanded action. After a short hesitation, Loretta dialed the number. Cynthia's voice came through the phone, at first cheerful, but gradually changing to worried as Loretta reported that Emily was missing. Thomas immediately joined the conversation, filling in the details. They confirmed the worst. Emily hadn't called them, hadn't left any messages, and they didn't know where she was either. If she was okay, she'd be in touch. That was the turning point. There was no longer any doubt something had gone wrong. The friends decided to take the next step, contacting the police. Officers arrived at Kenyon College on the afternoon of Nova 3. Two police officers, Detective Surgeon John Lancaster and his partner Stephen Harris, began by looking around her dorm room. They scrutinized everything, but, like Emily's friends, found no signs of a struggle or signs of forced entry. It seemed that Emily had simply left, closing the door behind her, and never returned. They noticed her wallet, identification, and credit cards, but nothing else of significance was found. The next step was to look for her car. The car's disappearance complicated matters. If Emily had truly left of her own free will, she could have traveled far, but if she had been abducted, the vehicle could be a key piece of evidence. At this point, it was the only tangible object that could lead the police to answers. The first hypothesis investigators considered was that the girl had simply decided to spend time alone with herself. Perhaps she needed to think, to put her thoughts in order after her dismissal from Pirates Cove, before the upcoming exams. But that theory weakened quickly. Emily never disappeared like that without telling anyone, especially her parents. Besides, if she had just decided to leave, she would have at least taken her purse. The second theory was kidnapping. That hypothesis was looking more and more likely. Emily hadn't shown up in almost 24 hours, hadn't made contact, and her car had disappeared with her. A kidnapping usually required some preparation, and if this was true, it meant that the perpetrator knew Emily, knew her routine, and took advantage of the moment when she was alone. That was what was most frightening. The police began the next phase of the investigation, interviews with Emily's friends, parents, and co-workers. They needed to understand who she was close to, who she had socialized with in the last few days, whether she had tensions with anyone. The investigation was just beginning, but it was already clear it would be a complicated case. The search for the girl continued, but so far it had been fruitless. The car was not found on the college campus, nor in nearby parking lots, nor in the Gambier area. There was no trace of Emily, and with each passing minute the hope for her safe return was fading. After the police had inspected Emily's dormitory and verified that she had left no notes or other traces leading to her location, the first interviews began. The investigators realized that time was playing against them. Every minute lost reduced the chance of finding the girl alive. The first logical group to interview were the friends who were expecting her at the party. Emily's friends gathered in a small room set aside by the college to talk to the investigators. The tension in the room was palpable. The students still couldn't believe what was happening. Loretta Frost, Emily's closest friend, was the first to speak. She described the evening at Pirates Cove when they came to celebrate her last day at work. "We sat at tables, joking around, reminiscing about how she accidentally mixed up orders or how she always had the most generous tips. It was hilarious. She laughed with us." Loretta looked down, clenching her fingers. "I can't believe she just Others present confirmed. Emily was in good spirits, didn't complain, showed no signs of anxiety. Investigators tried to determine if any of the friends could have been involved. They were all at the party when Emily finished her shift, which means they all had alibis. Besides, if the kidnapper had been among them, he wouldn't have been so active in the search. The friends were above suspicion. The next step was to talk to Emily's parents, Thomas and Cynthia Murray. They arrived in Gambier on the morning of November 5, overwhelmed with anxiety and fatigue from a sleepless night. Detective Lancaster motioned for them to sit down before beginning their conversation. Thomas spoke first. "Emily would never disappear like that. She's not the type to run away. If she wanted a break from everyone, she would have left a note, or at least called us." He fell silent, struggling with his emotions. It's not her." Cynthia nodded. "We talked to her 2 days ago. She was happy, talking about her plans for her studies, how glad she was that she'd have more time for philosophy now. If something was bothering her, she'd tell me. She always talked." Investigators asked about possible conflicts, about people with whom Emily might have felt tension. The parents shook their heads negatively. She didn't have any enemies. She was so kind. If she had problems, she solved them with words, not conflict. They couldn't give the investigation any new information, but their desperate belief that Emily would never have disappeared of her own free will strengthened the abduction theory. Investigators returned to Pirates Cove to interview Emily's co-workers. First up was bartender Nathaniel Justice, the last person to see her before she disappeared. "I was standing behind the bar when she was looking for her keys. She looked at me, grinned, and said something like, 'They probably just decided to hide from me.' I laughed, saying that maybe it was a sign that it was time for her to stay working here permanently. Then she left and I never saw her again." Investigators scrutinized his reactions, but he didn't seem nervous or confused in his statements. When the police decided to check his file, they found nothing suspicious. Justice was a regular guy who worked in a bar, had no criminal record and no criminal ties. He came up clean. But the next restaurant employee raised more questions. When it was Gregory McKnight's turn to be interviewed, the atmosphere changed. Unlike Nathaniel, he didn't look worried, more like annoyed. He sat with his arms crossed, answering one-word answers. McKnight answered dryly, avoiding unnecessary words. He was friendly with the staff, but he didn't let people get too close to him. Those who knew him claimed he was always like that. He didn't fit in, kept to himself. No one could say he was Emily's friend, but he had no enemies. After the conversation ended, the detectives decided to do a background check. They requested his file and soon discovered something unexpected. McKnight had been in trouble with the law before. In 1992, when he was just 15 years old, he shot and killed a man in Columbus. For that, he served time at the Circleville Youth Center Correctional Center and was released in 1997. He then married former correctional officer Catherine McKnight and settled in Gambier. That information changed the course of the investigation. Up until that point, police had no real suspect, but now there was the first person who raised questions. His past, strange behavior under questioning, and dry, curt answers made them wary. While the police dealt with McKnight, the search for Emily didn't stop. Volunteers scoured the neighborhood, checking roads, wooded areas, trying to find any trace of her car. But nothing. The girl seemed to disappear. Meanwhile, the investigators knew they had to take the next step, to scrutinize McKnight's life. Perhaps there was something behind his silent, withdrawn personality that would help solve the mystery of Emily Murray's disappearance. It's been just over a month since Emily Murray's disappearance. The police continued to investigate, but clues to her whereabouts were woefully lacking. However, fate intervened in an unexpected way. In early December, investigators received new information. It turned out that Emily Murray was not the only person who had gone missing this year. In May 2000s, 20-year-old Greg Julius disappeared in Chillicothe, Ohio. His girlfriend Dana Bostic reported to police that he had not been in contact since the spring. Upon investigation, detectives determined that one of his last known stops was a home in a rural area near Rayo. That home belonged to Gregory McKnight. This coincidence could not be ignored. In Emily's case, the police did not yet have direct evidence against McKnight, but Julius' disappearance and his possible connection to McKnight gave a legitimate reason to arrest him. The prosecutor's office authorized his arrest on another case, and police went to his trailer. On December 9, 2000, investigators arrived at McKnight's trailer, located in the middle of nowhere near the small community of Ray. However, he was not at the site. The trailer looked abandoned and the doors were locked. But the most important shock awaited the police officers not inside, but outside. On the lot next to the trailer stood a dark green Subaru Outback. It was Emily Murray's car. Officers immediately requested a search warrant. Given the discovery, a judge quickly granted permission. A few hours later, a forensics team broke inside the trailer. The first thing they smelled was the musty odor of decomposition. Once inside, police officers illuminated the room with flashlights. The picture was chaotic, scattered things, clothes, garbage, but their attention was immediately drawn to the dark stains on the carpet in the hallway. The experienced criminalist immediately realized it was blood. The footprints led down the hallway to one of the bedrooms. There, in the far corner of the room, among a pile of old junk, they found the body of Emily Murray. It was wrapped in a rug that had already begun to decompose. Investigators could not immediately believe their eyes. After a month of searching, the girl was found, but not alive. An inspection of the trailer brought even more shocking discoveries. Right in the living room, in one of the drawers, they found 5 0.357 Magnum shell casings. In another drawer in the bedroom, they found 7 9mm bullets. These findings immediately became important clues. If McKnight had such a weapon at his disposal, there was a good chance that it had been used in the murder. But the grisly findings didn't end there. In the living room, among the chaos of scattered things, the police came across a package with a bloody piece of gray Scotch tape. Nearby were signs of a struggle, a broken chair, bloodstains that, at first glance, didn't seem too noticeable. They also found a thin trail of dried blood on the hallway floor, leading from the front door to the bedroom where Emily's body had been hidden. This indicated that the girl had been killed here and then dragged to another room where she had been left. But perhaps the most gruesome discovery awaited investigators outside the trailer. After the discovery of Emily Murray's body, forensic investigators continued to survey the area around Gregory McKnight's trailer. Despite the December chill, the damp ground held new mysteries. They scrutinized every corner of the property, trying to find additional clues. It was then that one of the investigators noticed a patch of ground that looked disturbed. The ground was loose, as if it had been recently dug up. As the shovels began to sink into the ground, burnt pieces of cloth showed up from underneath. Soon after, human bones were discovered. They were lying shallow, as if someone had been in a hurry to get rid of the body. Experts quickly realized that the remains had been exposed to fire. The bones were partially charred, and fabric found nearby showed signs of burning. Someone had tried to cover up the crime, but burning the body completely failed. That wasn't the only find, however. A little farther from the trailer was an old abandoned well, which also attracted the attention of investigators. Inside, among the garbage and dirt, they came across more remains, fragments of bones, pieces of clothing and shoes. The clothes were partially destroyed, but one of the items retained patterns that later helped identify the victim. The examination took several days, but the first results showed that the remains belonged to Greg Julius, a 20-year-old Chillicothe resident who had been missing since the spring of 2000s. This was irrefutable proof. McKnight was the killer even before Emily disappeared. Now the police had to find out what connected him to the two victims and how he chose those he decided to kill. After the gruesome findings in Gregory McKnight's trailer, investigators realized they couldn't wait any longer. He was dangerous, and every missed moment could give him a chance to escape. Operatives launched an urgent manhunt, tracking his last movements. McKnight didn't show up in his trailer or his usual places, but soon he was spotted near the town of Chillicothe. He moved quietly, as if unaware that he was already being hunted. On December 10, 2000s, police caught up with him near a gas station. They surrounded him, gave him clear instructions not to resist. But McKnight wasn't going to. He held up his hands and let himself be handcuffed, showing neither fear nor surprise. His face remained impassive, as if what was happening did not concern him. At the station, the charges were read to him: double murder, kidnapping, illegal possession of weapons. He listened to them silently, without asking questions, without trying to justify himself. The investigators watched his reactions carefully, but saw no remorse or excitement. He had a trial ahead of him, and with the evidence found in the trailer, he had no chance of getting away with it. After McKnight's arrest, the investigation continued. The police now had overwhelming evidence linking him to the murders. Preparing for trial, prosecutors began putting together a case that would get him the maximum sentence. But one question remained: why did he kill Emily? She had no particular conflict with him, no animosity toward him. Did that mean her death was accidental, or was it premeditated? These questions were to be answered during the trial. Meanwhile, Kenyon College and the entire local community were shocked by the news. The entire town, Emily's friends and family, had hoped for a miracle, but ended up facing a harsh reality. Now everyone waited for the trial in which McKnight would have to answer for what he had done. After Gregory McKnight's arrest, the investigation did a thorough job of preparing for the trial. The prosecutor's office was confident that they had enough evidence to prove the defendant's guilt and were preparing to present it to the jury. The principal evidence was the recovered bodies of the two victims, traces of blood in the trailer, gun casings and bullets, and Emily Murray's stolen automobile, which was parked right next to McKnight's residence. McKnight himself behaved the same way at all stages of the investigation. He made no confessions, did not cooperate with detectives, and did not attempt to justify himself. His face remained impassive and his demeanor cold. This only strengthened the confidence of investigators that before them a real predator, a man who knows neither fear nor remorse. The trial began on October 5, 2022, in the courthouse in Vinton County, Ohio. In the hall were present not only lawyers but also numerous journalists, Emily's classmates, her teachers, as well as parents of the murdered. The general atmosphere was tense. Everyone realized that what was at stake was not just a murder case, but a question of justice and punishment for the crimes that had shaken the local community. At the first hearing, the prosecutor presented the main evidence and immediately outlined the main line of the prosecution's case. McKnight had committed two brutal murders, kidnapped and held Emily, and then disposed of the bodies in cold blood, hiding them in his trailer and yard. During the trial, the court heard testimony from Emily's parents, friends, and co-workers. Each of them spoke warmly of her, remembering what a kind, intelligent, and dreamy girl she was, who never hurt anyone. Thomas and Cynthia Murray, speaking in court, could not hold back tears. Emily's father talked about how their daughter dreamed of becoming a priest, how she loved to travel and help people. Her mother recalled her childhood years, talking about the letters Emily wrote to them from college, her love of books, and her dreams for the future. When it came to talking about the evidence found, The room froze. The forensic scientist, who was the first to enter McKnight's trailer after obtaining the search warrant, detailed how they found Emily's body wrapped in a rug in one of the bedrooms. He described bloodstains in the hallway, signs of a struggle found in the living room, and then presented the court with photographs of bullets and shell casings found in drawers. But the most difficult moment of the trial was the account of the second body. The judges and jurors could hardly conceal their shock as the expert described how the remains of Greg Julius had been found in a hole behind the trailer and in an old abandoned well. There was complete silence in the room as the prosecutor presented photographs of the dig site. It was obvious that McKnight had tried to burn the body but had not followed through. Greg Julius' girlfriend Dana Bostic, who was present, couldn't stand it and cried when she heard police find his burned clothes and bone fragments in the well. She told how she waited for his call, how she hoped he had just disappeared for a little while, but he couldn't be gone forever. The defense and strategy of the attorneys. Gregory McKnight's lawyers tried to build a defense on doubt. They argued that the evidence was insufficient, that the bullets found could have belonged to anyone, that the blood in the trailer could have been there long before these events. They claimed that someone could have planted the bodies in the trailer to frame McKnight, but those arguments were unconvincing. The main blow to the defense came from a forensic scientist who explained that all the evidence found was chronologically consistent with the time of Emily and Greg Julius' disappearance. Ballistics experts proved that the .357 Magnum cartridge casings matched the bullet found in Emily's head, and DNA experts determined that the blood on the trailer floor was hers. In an additional blow to the defense, Emily's car was found near McKnight's house. There was no way he could explain how her car ended up there, and this finally convinced the jury that he was involved in her murder. After weeks of hearings, the court reached a verdict. On October 10, 2002, the Vinton County Court found Gregory McKnight guilty of the murder of Emily Murray, the murder of Greg Julius, kidnapping, unlawful possession of a weapon, and several other crimes. On October 25, 2002, Gregory McKnight was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The court also added 38 years in prison to his sentence for other offenses, including car theft, kidnapping, and unlawful possession of a weapon. Gregory McKnight is still on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Chillicothe, Ohio. Despite the conviction, the death penalty has not yet been carried out. The Christmas season of 1961 was, as it always is in Newfoundland, harsh, frosty, with piercing winds and snowdrifts plunging the streets of small towns into white silence. In one of the families in these parts, January 28, 1961, a girl was born, who was named Shirley Jane Turner. Her parents were simple people, without high wealth, but with a firm character. Her father made his living in the fishing industry. Like many in the area, he was also a former U.S. serviceman, and her mother took care of the home and the children. Shirley grew up determined and ambitious. Already in early childhood, she showed a difficult character. She easily went to the conflict, defending her point of view, was often stubborn and irascible. At school, she showed good results but had few friends. Her persistence and tendency to dominance sometimes repelled others. It was difficult to change her mind. She never admitted to mistakes, and if something did not go according to her plan, became aggressive. Nevertheless, her persistence paid off. She enrolled at Memorial University of Newfoundland, choosing to study medicine. Shirley dreamed of a career as a doctor, longing for the recognition and respect she felt she deserved. But along with this, a sense of superiority grew in her. She did not tolerate criticism, and always thought that she knew better how things should be. Her personal life was more complicated. She had relationships over the years growing up, but many didn't stand up to her character. She married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce. From these unions, she was left with 3 children, but gradually they began to spend more time with their fathers or other relatives. Shirley herself decided that family was not her calling and focused on her career, becoming a fully independent woman. By the end of the 90s, Turner was already a certified doctor, worked in various medical institutions, and continued to move up the career ladder. She seemed strong, determined, but her character made her a loner. It was during this period that she met the man who seemed like he could change her life. A young doctor named Andrew Bugbee. Andrew David Bugbee was born on September 21, 1973, to David and Kate Bugbee. Unlike Shirley, his childhood was filled with warmth and care. He grew up in sunny California, where he was surrounded by loving family and friends. From an early age, he showed friendliness, responsiveness, and desire to help people. Andrew easily found a common language with others, able to listen and support. At school, he was a favorite of teachers and friends, the very person on whom you can rely. His dream of medicine appeared in childhood, and he confidently went to its realization. After graduating from high school, he entered medical school, then did his residency in Pennsylvania. His friends and colleagues admired his kindness and sense of humor. He was someone who was always there to help, whether it was patients, friends, or casual acquaintances. By the early 2000s, his career was gaining momentum. He was a promising doctor, and a future full of opportunity lay ahead of him. But that's when Shirley Turner came into his life. Andrew and Shirley met in a medical environment when they both worked in a hospital. What initially brought them together was their shared passion for medicine, talking about work and research. Despite the age difference, Shirley was 13 years older than Andrew. A romantic relationship developed between them. This union looked strange to others. Andrew, a young, kind, energetic man surrounded by friends, and Shirley, demanding, irascible, prone to manipulation. Their relationship was not peaceful from the beginning. Shirley possessed possessive tendencies. She was jealous of Andrew's friends, his co-workers, even his parents. She demanded accountability for every move, constantly making a scene if things didn't go her way. Andrew, being a soft person, tried to avoid conflicts, but gradually began to change, became less open, more tense. Friends noticed that something was going wrong but could not intervene. Every time the relationship reached an impasse, Shirley manipulated the situation so that Andrew stayed with her. But in the fall of 2001, he finally made a decision. He could no longer tolerate her tantrums, controlling behavior, and constant accusations. In early November, he told her he was breaking up. November 5, 2001 was a cold and stressful night for Andrew. He had been working at the hospital all day and had to meet with Shirley in the evening. She insisted on talking, saying they needed to discuss things one last time. He agreed, but his co-workers noticed he didn't seem convinced. "I just want her to realize it's over," he told one friend before leaving. That night, Andrew didn't come home. His phone wasn't answering. No one knew where he was. At first, friends and colleagues did not panic. It's not much. Perhaps he decided to take a break, to spend the evening alone. But with each passing hour, the anxiety grew. The next morning, November 6, passers-by walking in a parking lot near a lake in Pennsylvania noticed something strange. On the pavement, among the fallen leaves, a man lay motionless. Frightened people immediately called the police and an ambulance. Within minutes, officers from the local police department arrived on the scene. EMTs quickly confirmed what was already obvious. The man was dead. Police officers began a search of the area. The man was found in an unnatural pose, his body slightly turned, as if he had tried to get up or move at the last moment. There were traces of blood on his clothes and around his body, and several dark stains on the pavement suggested that death had occurred here. The first major discovery was the bullet marks. Upon examining the body, the officers noticed several small lacerations in the chest and face area. This was not an accident, there was a murder in front of them. Medical examiners on the scene confirmed the death and reported several gunshot wounds. No weapon was found nearby, which ruled out the suicide version. Now the first task for the police was to identify the deceased. In the pockets of the man's clothes were found keys, phone, and wallet. Inside the wallet were a driver's license, medical records, and several bank cards. According to the documents, Andrew David Bugbee, a 28-year-old physician who worked at a local hospital, was lying in front of the officers. To confirm his identity, officers contacted the hospital where Bugbee worked. Several of his co-workers expressed shock and immediately confirmed that he had indeed failed to show up for his shift. The next step was to notify his family. Bagby's parents, who lived in the U.S., received the terrible news from police officers. Their son had been found dead. Now the investigation had a name for the victim. Ballistics, forensics, the weapon of crime. Initial autopsy and forensic results showed that Bugbee had been killed by several shots at point-blank range. To find out more details, the police called in ballistics experts. A few days later, the ballistics experts provided a report that shed light on the details of the crime. It was determined that the murder was committed with a .22 caliber handgun. The shots were fired at close range, indicating a personal motive. A total of 5 shots were fired to the chest, face, neck, and head. This manner of killing spoke of a violent personal motivation. This was not a random shootout or robbery. The perpetrator had purposefully ensured that Bugbee would not survive. Now the police needed to figure out who might have wanted him dead. As officers began interviewing Bugbee's co-workers and friends, Shirley Turner's name began to appear all too often. One by one, his acquaintances revealed that their relationship with Shirley was strained, full of arguments, jealousy, and manipulation. Doctors who worked with Bugbee said he wanted to break up with her, but she was unwilling to accept it. Some recalled that she was emotionally unstable, prone to outbursts of anger. Bugbee's parents also confirmed that their son was afraid of Turner and tried to end his relationship with her. Police realized Shirley Turner was the prime suspect. Their job now was to locate her at the time of the murder and see if she could have purchased or possessed a .22 caliber weapon. After Shirley Turner's name began to come up in every conversation with Bagby's co-workers and acquaintances, police began searching for her. The first task was to determine where she was on the day of the murder and what she had been doing in recent weeks. Investigators made a request to check her recent movements, including travel information, transportation tickets, surveillance footage, and any signs of activity that could help reconstruct her itinerary. It was obvious that she had been under a great deal of emotional stress since her breakup with Bugbee, but the question remained: where had she gone since their last meeting? At the same time, her phone records were being checked. The police analyzed incoming and outgoing calls, especially in the days leading up to the murder. Was there an attempt to contact the victim? If so, with what motive? Also of interest were her conversations with other people. Perhaps she shared her thoughts or mentioned plans to someone. In addition, the investigators began to examine her financial transactions. Withdrawals, purchases in stores, possible purchases that could shed light on her intentions. Expenses in the final days before the murder were particularly scrutinized. At first glance, the police had ample reason to view Shirley Turner as the prime suspect. Her relationship with Bugbee had been strained, the breakup had been accompanied by emotional outbursts, and their last meeting had taken place shortly before the murder. For now, however, this was only circumstantial evidence. Investigators had more evidence to find. The key was to establish her whereabouts at the time of the crime. At the moment, the police did not know where she was or what she had been doing since her last conversation with Bugbee. This required a thorough analysis of her movements, phone calls, and financial transactions. Realizing that with each passing day the chance of finding important clues was diminishing, investigators began to work faster. They needed to gather enough evidence to make formal charges and take the next step. But most importantly, they had to keep an eye on the suspect before she disappeared for good. The first thing the police noticed was the victim's phone calls. The day before the murder, November 4, 2001, Andrew had several conversations with Shirley Turner. It was clear from the call records that he did not initiate these conversations. On the contrary, it was Turner who persistently called him, and at some point he answered. Their conversation lasted a few minutes and was followed a short time later by another, longer one. After reviewing testimony from Bagby's co-workers and friends, police were able to surmise that the conversation was not a pleasant one. Most likely Shirley was pressuring Andrew, trying to convince him to meet with her one last time. He hesitated, but eventually agreed, perhaps to put a definitive end to their relationship. It was now up to the police to establish where Shirley Turner herself was at that moment. It was known that she lived in Iowa, but her phone activity and travel records told a different story. It turned out that on November 4, she had traveled several hundred miles, leaving Iowa and heading to Pennsylvania. The journey looked strange, but it became even more suspicious when investigators discovered that she had stopped in another state along the way. That fact didn't seem important at first, but after a police check it became clear that detour in her itinerary was no accident. It was there that she picked up a firearm. She had purchased a .22 caliber handgun shortly before. Paperwork confirmed that she legally owned the firearm, and after the purchase she signed up for firearms training. Her shooting instructor said Turner showed an interest in practicing accurate hits and regularly visiting the range. However, there was something unusual about her behavior. She wasn't just learning to shoot. Her training was intense, focused, as if she was preparing for something specific. But the most curious thing happened on the eve of the murder. The instructor told police that on 9/3, the day before Bugby's last call, Shirley came to the range but looked worried. She said her gun was missing. At the time, no one paid much attention to it. Little did they know perhaps it was really lost. But now this information looked very different. Investigators began to suspect that this statement was made deliberately to prepare an alibi in advance in case the gun was found after the murder. Further analysis of the data confirmed that on November 4, after Shirley contacted Andrew, she was indeed in Pennsylvania. And then another important piece of evidence surfaced. Eyewitnesses near the parking lot near the lake where Bugby's body was later found said they saw two cars that evening, a Toyota Corolla and a Toyota RAV4. This was particularly significant because the former belonged to Andrew Bugby and the latter to Shirley Turner. This became one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence. If Turner's car was there, then she was also at the crime scene. Now the police realized that the version of her involvement in the murder was becoming more and more obvious. But before formal charges could be brought, investigators had to determine what had happened to Shirley after the murder. This was critical, because if they could prove that she had left the country in a hurry, it would look like an attempt to escape justice. They soon found the answer. On November 12, 2001, just days after the murder, Turner left the United States. She flew out of the airport in Toronto and then headed to St. John's, a small town in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. That's where she settled. She may not have had a clear plan, but one thing was clear: she wanted to get as far away from the crime scene as possible. While the police were working on her movements, another department was looking at her correspondence and personal records. It was then that investigators made an unexpected discovery. Shirley was pregnant. Her emails to Bugby were about the baby, about being there for him, about taking responsibility. In one message, she practically begged him to change his mind. But Bagby's friends and co-workers said he doubted the sincerity of those words. He didn't believe a child would make a difference, and felt Turner was using this as a way to keep him. Later, while searching her belongings, the police found ultrasound scans that finally confirmed Shirley Turner's pregnancy. This discovery added even more complications to the case. Now, in addition to the legal intricacies of her move to Canada, there was another factor. She was carrying the victim's child. Now, investigators faced a real problem. They were sure that Turner was guilty, but it was no longer possible to arrest her on U.S. soil. They had to start the extradition process, which meant months of legal battles. The police realized that time was playing against them. If Shirley could find good lawyers in time, if the Canadian system decided not to extradite her to U.S. authorities, the investigation could reach a dead end. But what worried investigators most was that Turner could disappear even further. She had already left the country, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't move again. Her pregnancy could have been a shield of sorts for her, a defense against prosecution, and police had to act quickly before it was too late. After police located Shirley Turner in Canada, a complicated extradition process began. U.S. authorities charged her with first-degree murder and sent a formal request to the Canadian government. Canadian law enforcement authorities, after reviewing the evidence received, decided to arrest her. On December 12, 2001, Shirley Turner was arrested in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. For investigators, this marked the first big step toward justice. The joy, however, was premature. It soon became clear that the case would be more complicated than first imagined. After his arrest, the judge hearing the case made an unexpected ruling. Despite the murder charges, he declared that Turner was not a threat to society. This conclusion was based on the fact that the crime was personal and not a threat to the general public. The Canadian court system at the time worked in such a way that suspects who did not pose a threat were often allowed to remain at large until their case was heard. That's what happened to Shirley. Shortly after her arrest, the court approved her release on a bail of 75,000 Canadian dollars. However, her freedom was limited. The court ordered Shirley Turner to surrender her passport to eliminate the possibility of fleeing abroad. She was also prohibited from leaving Newfoundland and Labrador without special permission from the court. In addition, she was required to report regularly to the police station for marking, to be supervised, and to comply with court-ordered conditions. In addition, she was strictly prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms to minimize the potential danger to others. Despite all these restrictions, the main thing remained the same. Turner was free, and the extradition process was turning into a real legal battle. The news of Turner's pregnancy soon became a central factor that changed the entire defense strategy. While the U.S. side was preparing documents for her extradition, a very different legal story began in Canada. The case was no longer just about murder. It was now about custody of a child who had not yet been born. The Canadian court system was faced with an issue that complicated matters. If Turner was extradited to the U.S., her child would either be born in prison or left motherless. The judges could not ignore this fact, and it began to influence their decisions. Meanwhile, Andrew Bugby's parents, David and Kate Bugby, were shocked by what was happening. They learned that their daughter-in-law was pregnant, and despite their grief, they made a firm decision they must fight for custody of the child. Shortly after Turner's arrest, they moved to Canada to be closer to the events and to follow the trial. They were to face enormous legal challenges. The laws in Canada that protected the rights of the mother made the situation extremely difficult. Despite the allegations against Turner, her pregnancy gave her a huge advantage in court. David and Kate Bugby were convinced that their grandson deserved a normal childhood, not a life alongside a woman accused of murdering his father. But the system didn't work that easily. On July 18, 2002, Zachary Turner, Andrew Bugby's son, was born in a St. John's hospital. That moment changed everything. With the birth of the child, the case took an even more confusing turn. Where before it was about Turner's potential extradition, now it became much more complicated. The judges realized that if they agreed to extradition, the infant would either be left motherless or forced to move to the United States. This called into question the very possibility of extraditing Shirley to the American authorities. Shirley Turner felt it. If her position had been precarious before, now she felt much more secure. The system no longer viewed her simply as an accused murderer. She was now the mother of a baby, and that gave her a huge advantage. She realized that with the baby in her arms, she could avoid extradition. Her main strategy now was to present herself not as a woman who had killed her former lover, but as a caring mother who wanted to be unjustly separated from her son. At the same time, Bugby's parents did not give up. They continued to seek custody of Zachary, arguing that a mother accused of murdering his father could not provide the child with a safe childhood. However, the courts continued to hesitate. For Shirley, on the other hand, life began to fall into place. Despite public pressure, she began to feel stable. She knew that the likelihood of her extradition with the baby was greatly reduced, and she made the most of it. Now that she had her son in her arms, she began to act confidently, creating the image of a good mother. She even started applying for financial aid, saying in interviews that she just wanted to live a quiet life and raise her son. But for David and Kate Bugby, this situation was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the fate of their grandson. They realized that if the courts continued to protect Turner, the child would remain in the hands of the woman they believed was his father's killer. With each passing day, the situation grew more complicated. What started out as a murder charge turned into a long and complicated custody battle. U.S. police and prosecutors continued to insist that Shirley Turner should be extradited to the U.S., but the Canadian court system was increasingly inclined to keep her in the country. The birth of the baby changed everything. Judges now had to consider not only the evidence of murder, but also the welfare of the infant. And that factor tipped the scales more and more in Turner's favor. As the lawyers struggled in the courts, Shirley continued to play her game. She realized that time was working for her. The longer she stayed in Canada, the harder it was for the American side to get her extradited. For Buggy's parents, it was a nightmare. After Zachary Turner was born, his fate became the subject of a bitter legal battle. Andrew Bugby's parents, David and Kate, realized that leaving the child with Shirley was not only morally wrong, but dangerous. They began an active custody battle, asking the court to recognize them as the boy's primary caregivers. The first months after the birth of the child showed that Zachary felt more comfortable in the company of grandparents than with his mother. Eyewitnesses who observed their interaction noted that the boy reacted more calmly to the presence of David and Kate, was more willing to spend time with them, and even began to cry when he was handed over to his mother. Shirley, despite her legal victory, showed little concern for the child. It seemed that to her he was more a tool for her extradition defense than an object of maternal love. Many acquaintances of the family noticed that she often left the boy in the care of others, neglected him, and generally did not appear to be a caring mother. Tension between Turner and Bugby's parents continued to build. At one point, the situation went so far that she even fired her family lawyer when she learned that he was expressing sympathy for David and Kate. She no longer trusted anyone. Despite the legal confusion, Shirley Turner's extradition to the United States remained possible. In November 2002, she was again imprisoned pending a decision by Canada's federal justice minister. The ministry had to determine whether to extradite her to U.S. authorities. David and Kate Bugby hoped this would be the end of an agonizing story. They believed that justice would finally be served and Shirley would be forced to stand trial for the murder of their son. But that hope quickly crumbled. In January 2003, the court made an unexpected and shocking decision. Shirley Turner was released again. The judge ruled that her crime was not a threat to the community, and that the murder of Andrew Bugby was a personal tragedy, not a public danger. Turner was now officially presumed innocent. She was once again free to live in Canada, which meant her chances of avoiding extradition became even better. On August 18, 2003, Zachary remained in the custody of his mother. Despite David and Kate Bugby's best efforts, the court did not give them the right to care for the child, and he remained with the woman they believed to be their son's killer. That day, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Turner was in her home in St. John's when she made a terrible decision. She spiked the baby's food with lorazepam, a powerful sedative that causes drowsiness and mental depression. As Zachary ate, the drug began to take effect. The child became increasingly lethargic and gradually fell asleep. Shortly thereafter, Shirley herself took a lethal dose of the same drug. She was not going to leave any chance for herself or her son. When Zachary was completely unconscious, Turner put warm clothes on him, then tied him to her chest with a sweater so that he could not get free. She then left the house, headed for the fishing pier, and jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. Shirley and Zachary's bodies were found breathless on shore the same day. Sea currents carried them to land where they were discovered by passers-by. Rescuers were called immediately, but it was too late. The child and his mother were dead. Michael Eugene Williams was born on October 16, 1969 in Breckenridge, Florida, to Jerry and Cheryl Williams. His parents were people of traditional views. His father worked as a construction worker. His mother worked in school administration. They instilled in their son honesty, hard work, and religious values. From childhood, Mike showed himself as a responsible and purposeful child. He early learned independence, helping his parents around the house, and spent his free time outdoors. Like many boys in his town, he was fond of hunting and fishing. His father often took him with him to water bodies and taught him the wisdom of hunting. In school, Mike was one of the best students. He was characterized by diligence, perseverance, and friendly character, for which he was loved by teachers and peers. He actively participated in school life, played on the soccer team, and despite his natural modesty was popular among the girls. After graduating from high school, Mike entered Florida State University, choosing the direction of real estate management. Studying was easy for him, and after classes he worked part-time in a real estate agency, gaining experience. Being a driven young man, he quickly realized that he wanted to build a successful career in this field. At university, Mike met Denise Morel, and their romance developed rapidly. She was a beautiful, well-groomed girl from a well-to-do family. Unlike Mike, who grew up in modest conditions, Denise is accustomed to comfort and wealth. She was attracted to Mike's confidence and efficiency. He was a man she could rely on, kind, considerate, and loyal. He surrounded Denise with care, fulfilled all her requests, dreamed of a happy family. In 1994, they got married. Their marriage seemed ideal. Two young, ambitious people built a successful life. Mike became one of the best real estate agents in Tallahassee, and Denise got a job in the banking sector. Soon they had a daughter, and to those around them, they became the model family. But over time, cracks began to appear. Mike, despite his success, remained a simple man who liked hunting, nature, sitting with friends. Denise dreamed of a luxurious life, expensive restaurants, travel, status in society. She became more demanding, irritable, and their relationship became strained. Since his high school years, Mike had a best friend, Brian Winchester. They grew up together, studied, played sports, and later worked in the same business. Their friendship was a strong, time-tested one. Friends' wives also became friends. Kathy Winchester and Denise often spent time together, discussing family matters. The two families more than once went on vacation, celebrated holidays. At first glance, Brian was as loyal and reliable as Mike. They hunted together, discussed business, supported each other in difficult moments. 6 months before his disappearance, Mike took out a large accident insurance policy, almost $2 million. It was a substantial sum, but no one paid much attention to it at the time. Mike worked in a risky field, hunted, often went outdoors, and insurance seemed a logical step. However, one remarkable fact is that the insurance agent who drew up the documents was Brian Winchester. More importantly, Denise was the sole beneficiary of the policy. December 16, 2000 started out as a very ordinary day. Mike, as planned, got up early in the morning, put on his camouflage clothes, and prepared to hunt. Lake Seminole, where he went, was his favorite place. He had known those waters since he was a boy and had hunted there many times. Duck hunting was his tradition, and this time nothing boded ill. At about 5:30 a.m., he kissed his wife, quietly looked out into the nursery where his young daughter was sleeping, and left the house. Got in his truck and headed out to the lake. The weather that day was cool and the water was covered with a light mist. Mike arrived at the location, launched the boat, and set sail. He was never seen again after that. On that day, December 16, 2000, no one immediately suspected anything wrong. The duck hunt might have gone on long enough. Mike might have lingered on the water, deciding to enjoy the quiet of nature, but the longer he was gone, the more concern grew. Around lunchtime, Brian Winchester began to worry. He knew that Mike had gone to Lake Seminole and should have been home by now. Along with his father, he decided to drive to the hunting spot to make sure his friend was okay. When they arrived at the lake, they noticed Mike's car parked near the shore, a green Ford Bronco. The car was parked neatly, as if the owner had just stepped away for a while, but he himself was nowhere to be seen. Inside the car, everything looked familiar. No signs of struggle, nothing suspicious. One thing was alarming, however. There was no Mike's boat near the shore. Brian and his father began to look around the shore, shouting his name, but there was only silence. It became clear something had happened. Realizing that they would not be able to find out anything on their own, Brian contacted the authorities. First on the scene were staff from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Their experience with bodies of water gave them hope of finding the missing man quickly. The first search was organized. They used boats, explored the coast, tried to determine where Mike's boat could be. However, the search soon had to be interrupted. A strong storm began. The wind raised the waves, the water became murky, and the rain sharply reduced visibility. In such conditions, further investigation of the water body was impossible. the rescuers were forced to postpone the search until better weather conditions. When the weather improved, the search resumed with even greater scope. Divers scoured the bottom of the lake, hoping to find the body or at least some clues. Sonar boats were brought in and on-land patrols scoured the shoreline. However, the results were nil. Lake Seminole is a vast expanse of water full of underwater hiding places, snags, and submerged trees. Its murky waters prevented clear visibility, making it difficult for rescuers. However, despite their efforts, no body, no signs of struggle, and no personal belongings of Mike were found. Some began to question whether he had actually drowned. In similar cases, at least some remains had surfaced or washed ashore. However, a few days later, a search party found Mike's boat. It was drifting close to shore, virtually untouched. The discovery of the boat raised a new stream of questions. First, the boat had not been overturned. If Mike had actually encountered an underwater obstacle, his boat would probably have capsized, but it didn't. Secondly, a hunting rifle was found in the boat in a case. This fact indicated that Mike hadn't even started hunting. Any experienced hunter would have deployed the gun immediately after arriving at the site, because on Lake Seminole, ducks met at dawn, and it was the morning hours were considered the most successful for hunting. It all seemed strange. If Mike had drowned accidentally, his body should have surfaced within a few days, but it was nowhere to be found. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, after some time, investigators concluded that Mike Williams was most likely the victim of an accident. According to the official version, his boat hit an underwater stump hidden in the murky waters of Lake Seminole. As a result of the sharp impact, Mike lost his balance and fell overboard. Because he was wearing heavy boots and thick hunting clothes, his shoes quickly filled with water, weighing down his body and preventing him from climbing back into the boat. Unable to stay on the surface, Mike went underwater and soon drowned. The investigators could not be definitively sure of this because the body was never found. However, they hypothesized that Mike's remains could be prey to alligators inhabiting the lake. In their opinion, that is why, after months of searching, failed to find any bones or other traces of his death. This version was officially recognized as the main one, and the case gradually began to wind down. However, there were those who did not believe in this theory. The version that Mike Williams drowned and was eaten by alligators did not seem convincing to his mother, Cheryl Williams. She knew that in such cases, at least some remains are bound to remain: bones, fragments of clothing, objects that were with the person. But after weeks and months of searching, they found absolutely nothing. The more time passed, the more anxious Cheryl became. She realized that even in an environment like Lake Seminole, the body should have surfaced in a few days or at least been swept ashore by underwater currents. But the water seemed to swallow her son without a trace. In addition, experienced investigators began to wonder, if Mike really drowned, why was his boat left in perfect condition? If he had fallen overboard, the boat should have either capsized or at the very least gotten wet on the inside. However, there were no signs of struggle or emergency inside. It looked as if Mike hadn't even started hunting. But despite the mounting questions, there was no hard evidence for the investigation. The search, which had lasted weeks, had yielded not a single significant lead. With no body, no witnesses, no obvious signs of a crime, the authorities had no choice but to accept Mike's death as a tragic accident. Cheryl, however, didn't believe that. Something was wrong, and the more she thought about her son's disappearance, the more it seemed to her that the official explanation was not just wrong, but deliberately hiding the truth. Years passed, but the mystery of Mike Williams' disappearance remained unsolved. Then the investigation gained momentum, then again came to a standstill. In different years, from 2004 to 2011, investigators again and again turned to this case, but each time it was closed. The only person who didn't give up and kept demanding answers was his mother, Cheryl Williams. She did not believe in the official version and believed that her son was not eaten by alligators, and someone deliberately tried to hide the truth. Over the years, Cheryl wrote letters, met with detectives, and tried to get media attention. She believed that if she kept pushing the investigation, sooner or later the truth would come out. Cheryl became not only the voice of her son but a real force that kept the case from fading into oblivion. After years of investigation, there are still new findings. During the next stage of the search, boots and a jacket belonging to Mike were found. The most important item was the jacket. In one of its pockets was a hunting license issued in Mike's name. This proved beyond a doubt that the items found belonged to him. But what alarmed the investigators the most was the condition of the clothes. The boots, jacket, and ID looked virtually untouched. They were not torn, tattered, or damaged, which strongly contradicted the alligator attack. If Mike's body had really fallen victim to wild animals, nothing would have been left of the clothes. The teeth and claws of alligators would have left obvious marks. However, this was not the case. This discovery was the first serious blow to the official version of his disappearance. In addition to Mike's mother, many acquaintances and family friends also doubted the official version of events. First, Mike did not like to hunt alone. Everyone who knew him said that he always called his friends to go duck hunting with him. For him, it was a tradition, hunting in the company, discussing plans, evening sitting around the campfire. But that day, for some reason, he went alone. Secondly, Mike was an extremely cautious man. Everyone recalled that his water safety techniques were amazingly pedantic. He never sailed a boat with boots on. That was his ironclad rule. Every time he swam away from the shore, he took off his boots because he knew that if he accidentally went overboard, the heavy shoes could drag him to the bottom. But the official version said that it was the boots that prevented him from saving himself. This fact raised serious questions. How could a man who had been cautious all his life ignore his own rules that day? In addition, local experts questioned the main argument of the investigation, that Mike's body was allegedly completely destroyed by alligators. The fact is that December is the cold season in Florida, and alligators at this time are in a state of torpor. They do not attack and practically do not eat in winter as their metabolism slows down. Consequently, the version that predators attacked and completely destroyed the body looked extremely unlikely. All these facts only strengthened the suspicions. Against this background, the behavior of the two people who seemed to be most concerned about Mike's fate stood out. His wife Denise and best friend Brian Winchester did not show the slightest desire to pursue the investigation. They accepted the version of the accident unquestioningly. Moreover, after receiving nearly $2 million in insurance money, Denise quickly accepted the loss. It wasn't long before she was starting a new chapter of her life. And the best part is with whom. Denise married Brian Winchester, her late husband's best friend. This couldn't help but arouse suspicion from those around her. Too many things in this story looked strange and raised questions. Mike disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found despite a lengthy search. Usually, even if a person drowns, the water after some time brings out at least fragments of clothing or remains, but in this case there were absolutely no traces. The official version of the investigation, according to which he drowned and was eaten by alligators, looked less and less plausible because of the many inconsistencies. In addition, Denise acted as if her husband's death was not particularly shaken. She easily made an insurance payment and soon lived a new life as if nothing had happened. The most suspicious was the fact that sometime later, Denise married Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. Many saw a hidden meaning in this strange marriage, but the investigation still had no direct evidence to prove the crime. For Cheryl, this was the final proof that her son was the victim of a conspiracy. Without hard evidence, however, she could prove nothing. As the years passed, the truth remained deeply hidden. On August 6, 2016, an event occurred in the small town of Tallahassee that shocked the locals. At first glance, it was just a family affair, but in reality, it was the key to solving one of the most mysterious mysteries of the past 2 decades. That day, Brian Winchester kidnapped his wife, Denise. It would seem that the man who for years had remained on the sidelines in the case of the mysterious disappearance of Mike Williams had suddenly committed the crime himself. But in fact, that was only the beginning. It all started early in the morning when Denise Winchester left the house as usual and headed to her car to drive to work. She didn't even realize she was being watched. As soon as she opened the door and got into the passenger compartment, Brian suddenly appeared from behind her. He had hidden in the back seat beforehand and was patiently waiting for the moment to take her by surprise. He clutched a gun in his hand, and as soon as Denise was inside, he moved forward sharply, pointing the weapon threateningly in her face. His breathing was heavy, and his voice trailed off into a scream. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. To him, divorce meant the complete destruction of the life they'd been working toward for years. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a betrayal he couldn't accept. Brian was in a state of extreme nervousness. His hands were shaking, his emotions were overwhelming him, and at one point he even turned the gun on himself. It seemed to him that if he lost Denise, he would no longer have any meaning in his life. He had backed himself into a corner, seeing no other option but to force her to stay close by using fear and pressure. Denise realized that any careless word could have irreparable consequences. She tried to keep her cool despite the obvious threat. Gradually, she managed to convince Brian that they could talk things over and that they should not make any hasty decisions. She assured him that she would not go to the police and that they still had a chance to make things right. Those words had an effect on Brian. He began to calm down, his grip loosened, and after a few hours he finally decided to let her go. He was sure Denise would keep her word and not betray him. But once she was free, she didn't hesitate to go to the police and file a report. After Denise's statement, the police quickly found Brian. He was arrested and charged with kidnapping and threatening to kill. At the trial, he looked lost. He already knew he could not escape punishment. In December 2017, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It seemed like just a family drama that got out of hand, but in fact it was the key to solving the most high-profile crime of recent years. Once behind bars, Brian Winchester remained silent for a long time. He hoped that he would be able to cope with the situation, but with each passing day he realized, now he is completely out of control. His power over Denise was gone, she had betrayed him, and worst of all, he was all alone. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. The once carefully thought-out plan had crumbled, and there was no way out anymore. After much thought, Brian realized that the only thing he had left was the truth. He had nothing to lose, so he decided to speak up. In one of his interrogations, he made a shocking confession. Mike Williams was not killed in an accident, he was murdered. Brian told how it all happened, and this moment became a turning point in the case, which for many years remained unsolved. They'd been in love since high school, but they were both married. Divorce? That was unacceptable to Denise. In their circle, divorce was considered a disgrace. It would mean condemnation from family, church, society. Denise wanted them to be together, but she didn't want to ruin her image as the perfect wife and mother. Then they had another option. Brian confessed that they realized that if Mike was not alive, all the problems would disappear by themselves. Denise would get the insurance and no one would suspect a thing. They decided to kill Mike. The day Mike Williams was killed, Brian was waiting for him at Lake Seminole. When Mike arrived to hunt, Brian got into his boat. They got out on the water and Brian said they should check out one good place to hunt. When they got far enough out, he jumped on Mike and pushed him overboard. He was floundering in the water, trying to stay on the surface. That's when Brian pulled out his gun and shot him. Mike died instantly, and Brian moved his body to another spot and buried it. Then he returned to the lake to fake the accident. Where was the body? Brian told the investigators where they had hidden Mike's remains. The police immediately went to the location Winchester had given them. They found the body. It was buried deep underground. Despite the time, the remains were in good enough condition to be forensically examined. Investigators took DNA samples and compared them to Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. 18 years after Mike's disappearance, his body was finally found. It was now clear. He hadn't drowned, he'd been murdered. Denise's arrest. After these confessions, the investigation finally had the evidence that had been missing for so long. When questioned, she tried to defend herself. She said that Brian had threatened her, that he forced her into the conspiracy, that she didn't want to kill him. But the interrogators already knew the truth. They knew that Denise and Brian had been together for years. They knew that her marriage to Mike was a sham. And most importantly, they knew that Denise was the mastermind behind the murder. She didn't want to lose her reputation. She didn't want to suffer the shame of divorce, but she wanted to be with Brian and get the insurance money. Denise's choice was fatal. Now she had to answer for her actions in court. The arrest of Denise Williams became a real sensation. Almost 18 years after the disappearance of Mike Williams, the investigation finally had undeniable evidence of her involvement in the crime. Now she had to stand trial and answer for what she had done. The prosecution was based on the confession of Brian Winchester, who detailed the conspiracy, the murder, the staged accident, and the motive for the crime. In addition to his testimony, the investigation had physical evidence, including Mike's remains and proof of insurance fraud. The case garnered tremendous public outcry. Tallahassee citizens who had once sympathized with Denise were now horrified to realize that she had deliberately orchestrated her husband's murder for money and a life with Brian. The prosecutor's office brought 3 serious charges against Denise Williams. First, she was found to be the organizer of a conspiracy to murder Mike Williams. Second, she was charged with insurance fraud. Third, she was charged with aiding and abetting first-degree murder. Prosecutors said Denise was a key figure in the conspiracy. Not only was she involved in planning the murder, but she actively contributed to its cover-up, misleading everyone for years. Denise's attorneys built a defense on her allegedly passive role in the crime. They argued that she was the victim of manipulation by Brian, who forced her to participate by threatening her. In addition, the defense tried to refute accusations that Denise orchestrated the murder for insurance money, arguing that she never showed any particular interest in her husband's money. But those arguments were shattered in court. The prosecutor's office presented evidence of Denise and Brian's long-standing affair, proving that Mike's murder was a carefully planned move for the sake of their future together and financial gain. During the trial, the prosecution presented the testimony of Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. She described how she had fought for justice for years, how she had faced resistance from Denise, and how she had suspected her of lying all these years. Also presented in court were phone records of Denise and Brian, which showed that they had been in contact after Mike's disappearance, which confirmed their conspiracy. The main witness, Brian Winchester, detailed how they planned the murder, what they did afterward, and how Denise suggested waiting until Mike was officially declared dead to get insurance. His testimony was so exhaustive that Denise's defense could not refute it. On December 14, 2018, a Leon County jury found Denise Williams guilty of conspiracy to murder, insurance fraud, and aiding and abetting first-degree murder. On February 17, 2019, she was sentenced to life without parole for conspiracy to murder and accessory to murder, and an additional 30-year term for insurance fraud. In 2020, Denise Williams appealed, and the trial panel reversed her conviction. First, she avoided a conviction for fraud. To dismiss the charge, she turned over the entire amount of the insurance payout and the house to her daughter, thereby recouping the money she received and formally avoiding punishment for the financial crime. Second, the court dismissed the charge of accessory to murder because there was no direct evidence that she directly participated in or assisted in the crime. Despite Brian Winchester's admission that the murder was committed as part of their conspiracy, there was no legal basis at that time to consider Denise an actual accomplice to the murder, because she was not present at the crime scene. So, in 2020, the court vacated the fraud and accessory to murder charges and changed the sentence. The new sentence was 30 years imprisonment for conspiracy to murder.